Hi guys, welcome back to another deep dive into the strange, unsettling, and often tragic corners of history. Tonight, we're exploring something that most history books gloss over or hide in footnotes, the dark reality of royal bloodlines in medieval Europe, and specifically, the women whose lives were shaped and often destroyed by the practice of inbreeding. We'll journey through centuries of dynastic marriages where power and prestige mattered more than health or happiness, and where the consequences of keeping bloodlines pure led to some of the most heartbreaking stories you've never heard. From physical deformities to mental decline, from stillborn children to entire family lines collapsing under the weight of their own genetic burden, this is a story about the price of power, the cruelty of tradition, and the women who paid that price with their very existence. We're going to take our time tonight, moving through royal courts, candlelit chambers, and the cold reality of what happened when families married too close to home for far too long. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. To understand the women we're about to discuss, we need to first understand what inbreeding actually meant in the context of medieval European royalty. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't ignorance. This was deliberate, calculated, and considered the proper way to maintain power. Royal families across Europe believed that their blood was sacred, that their right to rule came from God Himself, and that mixing with common blood would dilute that divine right. So they married within their own families, over and over again, generation after generation. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. Sometimes the family trees looked less like trees and more like tangled webs, where the same names appeared over and over in different positions. The practice was especially common in ruling dynasties, where land and titles were precious commodities that couldn't be allowed to slip into the hands of outsiders. In medieval times, marriage wasn't about love or even compatibility. It was a political tool, a way to forge alliances, consolidate territories, and strengthen claims to thrones. But there was always a tension in these calculations. On one hand, marrying outside your immediate family could bring new alliances, new wealth, new territories. On the other hand, it meant sharing power with outsiders, people who might have their own ambitions, their own claims, their own ideas about how things should be run. So many royal families chose the path of least resistance, the path that kept everything in the family. They convinced themselves, and their subjects, that royal blood was special, that it carried with it not just the right to rule, but some kind of superior quality that would be diminished by mixing with lesser bloodlines. The origins of this practice can be traced back to ancient civilizations. The Egyptian pharaohs, as we'll discuss more later, practiced sibling marriage for religious and political reasons, believing that their divine status required keeping their bloodline absolutely pure. This practice influenced later dynasties in different parts of the world. In Persia, the Zoroastrian tradition actually encouraged marriages between close relatives, believing it was religiously meritorious. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia and his generals established their own kingdoms, including the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, they adopted and adapted these practices, combining Greek customs with local traditions. The idea that royal blood was fundamentally different from common blood, that it needed to be preserved unmixed, became deeply embedded in the ideology of monarchy across multiple cultures. In medieval Europe, the situation was complicated by the Christian Church's teachings on marriage. Early Christianity had adopted Jewish prohibitions against incest, defining certain relationships as too close for marriage. The book of Leviticus in the Old Testament listed prohibited relationships, and the early church fathers expanded on these prohibitions. But as Christianity spread and became intertwined with political power, these rules became negotiable for the powerful. Kings and nobles needed to make strategic marriages, and sometimes the most strategic marriage was to a close relative. The Church developed the concept of dispensations, special permissions that could override the normal prohibitions, and these dispensations became a significant source of papal power and revenue. The Catholic Church technically had rules against marriages between close relatives. Canon law prohibited marriages between people related within 4 degrees of consanguinity, which meant you weren't supposed to marry anyone closer than a third cousin. But these rules were flexible when it came to royalty. Popes could grant dispensations, special permissions that allowed close relatives to marry despite the prohibitions. And these dispensations were granted frequently, especially when the families involved were powerful enough to make it worth the Church's while. Sometimes the dispensations came with conditions, like promises to go on crusade or donations to build cathedrals, but they came nonetheless. The Church understood the political realities of medieval Europe, and it understood that maintaining good relationships with powerful families was often more important than strictly enforcing rules about who could marry whom. The process of obtaining a dispensation was itself revealing of the power dynamics involved. A royal family seeking to marry 2 closely related members would send representatives to Rome, bearing gifts and making promises. The case would be presented to church officials, who would consider the political implications, the potential benefits to the church, and the theological arguments for allowing the marriage. Theologians would craft justifications, arguing that the marriage would serve the greater good, would strengthen Christian kingdoms against their enemies, would bring peace between warring factions. The fact that the marriage might produce children with genetic problems was not part of the calculation, because the connection between heredity and health wasn't understood. The dispensation, once granted, would be a formal document with elaborate language about divine mercy and pastoral concern, but everyone involved knew it was fundamentally a political transaction. What nobody fully understood at the time were the genetic consequences of these marriages. The science of heredity wouldn't be discovered for centuries. Gregor Mendel wouldn't conduct his experiments with pea plants until the 1800s, and the structure of DNA wouldn't be understood until the 1950s. Medieval people could see that inbreeding sometimes produced children with problems, physical deformities, weakness, early death, but they didn't understand why. They attributed these problems to God's will, to curses, to the mother's behavior during pregnancy, to astrological influences, to anything except the actual cause. Some observers did notice patterns, did see that certain families seemed to have more problems than others, but without an understanding of genetics, they couldn't make the connection between the marriage patterns and the health outcomes. Medieval medical theory was based largely on the works of ancient physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, filtered through Islamic medical scholars and then translated into Latin. These texts discussed heredity in vague terms, noting that children resembled their parents and that certain traits and diseases seemed to run in families. But the mechanisms were completely misunderstood. The dominant theory involved the mixing of male and female seed, with various ideas about how traits were transmitted. Some believed that the male seed contained a miniature person that simply grew in the womb, nourished by the mother's blood. Others believed that both male and female contributed material that mixed together. But none of these theories could explain why inbreeding caused problems, or even definitively establish that it did cause problems. Folk wisdom sometimes got closer to the truth than learned medical theory. Farmers and animal breeders knew from practical experience that breeding closely related animals led to problems. Dogs bred too closely would produce puppies with deformities or weak constitutions. Horses bred from the same bloodlines repeatedly would lose vigor and speed. Cattle would give less milk and produce weaker calves. This practical knowledge led to efforts to bring in breeding stock from distant herds to maintain the health and productivity of livestock. But this folk wisdom was seen as applying to animals, not to humans, and certainly not to royalty, whose blood was believed to be fundamentally different from that of common people and even common animals. The genetic reality is straightforward but devastating. Every person carries 2 copies of most genes, one from each parent. Some genes are recessive, meaning they only cause problems if you inherit the problematic version from both parents. In a large, diverse population, the chances of both parents carrying the same rare recessive gene are small. But when close relatives marry, the chances increase dramatically because they share so many of the same genes from their common ancestors. The more closely related the parents are, and the more generations of inbreeding in their family history, the more likely it becomes that harmful recessive genes will pair up in their children. This can lead to a wide range of problems, from relatively minor issues to severe disabilities and early death. The effects accumulate over generations as the gene pool becomes smaller and smaller until eventually the family line may become non-viable. Modern genetic studies have been able to reconstruct the family trees of some of these royal dynasties and calculate their coefficients of inbreeding. The coefficient of inbreeding is a number between 0 and 1 that represents the probability that a person has inherited the same gene from both parents because both parents inherited it from a common ancestor. A coefficient of 0 means no inbreeding, while higher numbers indicate increasing levels of inbreeding. For comparison, the coefficient of inbreeding for a child of first cousins is about 0.0625. For a child of an uncle and niece, or of half-siblings, it's about 0.125. For a child of full siblings, it's 0.25. Charles II of Spain had a coefficient of inbreeding estimated at about 0.254, higher than if his parents had been full siblings, because of the accumulation of inbreeding over many generations. Now let's talk about specific women whose lives were marked by this practice. We'll start with Maria Ana of Spain, who lived in the 17th century and whose very existence was shaped by generations of Habsburg inbreeding. The Habsburg family ruled Spain, Austria, and large parts of Europe for centuries, and they were notorious for their practice of marrying within the family. Maria Anna was born in 1606, the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria. Already, this was a marriage between close relatives. Margaret was Philip's cousin, but their own ancestry was even more tangled. If you traced back just a few generations, you'd find the same names appearing over and over. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, appeared multiple times in Maria Anna's family tree, both on her father's side and her mother's side. The Habsburg family's rise to power is itself a fascinating story that helps explain why they became so obsessed with inbreeding. The family originated in what is now Switzerland, taking their name from their castle, the Habitsburg or Hawk's Castle. Through strategic marriages, military conquests, and political maneuvering, they gradually accumulated territories and titles. By the 15th century, they had become one of the most powerful families in Europe. The family motto, which appeared in various forms, was often rendered as "Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry," referring to their strategy of expanding power through marriages rather than military conquest. This strategy worked brilliantly for building an empire, but it also meant that the family became increasingly intertwined with itself as they married and remarried among the limited number of suitable royal partners. Maria Anna's appearance reflected this genetic burden. She had the characteristic Habsburg jaw, a pronounced underbite that was so common in the family it became known as the Habsburg lip or the Austrian lip. This wasn't just a cosmetic issue. The severe underbite made eating difficult, speaking unclear, and contributed to dental problems and infections. But for the Habsburgs, this deformity had become so common that it was almost a badge of family identity. They were proud of their distinctive appearance, seeing it as proof of their pure bloodline. Maria Anna also suffered from other health problems throughout her life, including digestive issues and general weakness. She was described by contemporaries as frail and sickly, someone who tired easily and often took to her bed. The Habsburg jaw is a fascinating example of how a genetic trait can become associated with a family identity. In portraits of Habsburg family members, the pronounced underbite is clearly visible, becoming more severe in later generations. Modern analysis of these portraits, combined with historical descriptions, has allowed researchers to track the progression of the trait through the family tree. Early Habsburgs in the 14th and 15th centuries show relatively normal jaw structure in their portraits. By the 16th century, the underbite is becoming noticeable in many family members. By the 16th century, the underbite is becoming noticeable in many family members. By the 17th century, it's severe and nearly universal in the Spanish branch of the family. This progression directly correlates with the increasing degree of inbreeding in the family. Recent genetic studies have attempted to identify the specific genes responsible for the Habsburg jaw. It appears to be a complex trait influenced by multiple genes that affect the development of the maxilla, the upper jaw, and the mandible, the lower jaw. When certain combinations of alleles are present, the lower jaw grows disproportionately compared to the upper jaw, creating the characteristic underbite. The trait shows a pattern consistent with autosomal dominant inheritance, with incomplete penetrance and variable expressivity, meaning that people who inherit the relevant genes don't always show the trait, and when they do, the severity varies. But in an inbred population where these alleles become increasingly common, more and more individuals will inherit combinations that produce the trait in its most severe form. But Maria Anna's personal suffering was just the beginning of her story. Like all royal women of her time, her primary purpose was to produce heirs, to continue the family line and provide the next generation of rulers. In 1615, when she was just 9 years old, she was betrothed to Ferdinand, who would become Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. This was, of course, another marriage between relatives. Ferdinand was her cousin. The wedding took place in 1616, when Maria Anna was barely 10 years old, though the marriage wasn't consummated until she was older. This was common practice in royal families, to arrange and formalize marriages early to secure political alliances, even if the couple didn't begin living as husband and wife until they reached physical maturity. The practice of child betrothals and marriages was controversial even in its own time. Some church officials and moral theologians argued against it, pointing out that children couldn't give meaningful consent to marriage, and that forcing them into marriages too young was harmful. But these objections were overridden by political necessity. Royal families wanted to secure alliances as early as possible, to prevent other families from making competing marriage arrangements, to establish clear lines of succession. A betrothal, even if the marriage wouldn't be consummated for years, created legal and political obligations that bound families together. Breaking a betrothal was possible but difficult, requiring papal dispensation and often causing political crises. So children, as young as 7 or 8, might find their entire futures determined by marriage contracts they had no part in negotiating. Maria Anna would eventually have 6 children who survived infancy, though she suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths in between. This pattern of pregnancy loss was common among inbred royal lines. The same genetic problems that caused physical deformities also increased the chances of miscarriage, stillbirth, and infant death. Each pregnancy was a gamble, and the emotional toll on women like Maria Anna was immense. They lived under constant pressure to produce healthy heirs, knowing that their value to their families and their husbands depended on their success. When babies died, which happened frequently, these women were often blamed, accused of not praying enough, not behaving properly, bringing bad luck or curses on the family. The reality was that their babies were dying because of the genetic burden carried by both parents, but nobody understood that at the time. The experience of miscarriage and stillbirth in this era was particularly traumatic because of the religious and social meanings attached to these losses. A miscarriage or stillbirth wasn't just a medical event, it was a spiritual crisis. Had God withdrawn his favor from the mother? Was she being punished for some sin? Had she been cursed by enemies? Were demons or witches responsible? These questions would be raised by those around her, and the mother herself would likely internalize them, wondering what she had done wrong, what she could have done differently. The grief of losing a child would be complicated by shame, guilt, and fear about what it meant for her future. And often, she would be expected to compose herself quickly and try again, to get pregnant as soon as possible, with little time to process her loss or heal emotionally. The medical care available for pregnancy complications was minimal and often harmful. When a woman was having a difficult pregnancy or a miscarriage was beginning, the treatments offered might include bloodletting to balance the humors, various herbal concoctions that were supposed to strengthen the pregnancy but might actually be harmful or useless, prayers and blessings from priests, and bed rest. If the miscarriage couldn't be stopped, the woman would have to deliver the dead fetus, a physically and emotionally agonizing process. If parts of the placenta or fetus were retained, which happened frequently, the woman could develop infections that might kill her. Many women died, not from the initial miscarriage, but from infections that developed afterward, puerperal fever and sepsis that would progress over days or weeks until the woman died in agony. Of Maria Anna's surviving children, several showed signs of the family's genetic problems. Her son Ferdinand IV became king of the Romans, but died young, at age 20, possibly from smallpox, but weakened by the general poor health that plagued the family. Her daughter, Maria Anna, named after her mother, married Philip IV of Spain, who was actually Maria Anna's brother. Yes, you heard that right. Maria Anna's daughter married Maria Anna's own brother, another example of the Habsburg practice of the closest possible family marriages. This marriage between uncle and niece, or alternatively between a woman and her mother's brother, produced several children, but only one survived to adulthood, and that child, Charles II of Spain, would become perhaps the most famous example of the devastating effects of inbreeding. This particular marriage between Maria Anna's daughter and Maria Anna's brother illustrates the complete disregard for genetic health in favor of political considerations. Philip IV needed a new wife after his first wife died. He could have married someone from a different royal family, bringing in genetic diversity and forming new political alliances. Instead, he married his own niece, his sister's daughter, doubling down on the Habsburg strategy of keeping everything within the family. The dispensation for this marriage was granted by Pope Innocent X, despite the extremely close relationship. The theological justification was that the marriage would strengthen the bonds between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family, maintain the purity of Habsburg blood, and prevent Habsburg territories from being divided or falling into the hands of rival families. Maria Anna of Spain died in 1646 at the age of 40, worn out by repeated pregnancies and lifelong poor health. She had done her duty, producing heirs and maintaining the Habsburg line, but at tremendous personal cost. Her story illustrates how royal women were trapped in a system that valued them primarily as vessels for continuing bloodlines, regardless of the physical and emotional toll it took on them. They had no choice in whom they married, no control over their reproductive lives, and no escape from the expectations placed upon them. And when those expectations were combined with the genetic burden of inbreeding, the results were often tragic. Her funeral was a grand affair, as befitted an empress, with elaborate ceremonies, masses said for her soul, and a tomb in the imperial crypt in Vienna where generations of Habsburgs were laid to rest. But the public mourning and official commemorations couldn't change the fact that her life had been consumed by dynastic duty, that she had suffered physically and emotionally in service to a family system that cared more about preserving power than about the well-being of its members. Her children and grandchildren would continue the pattern, marrying within the family, producing increasingly unhealthy offspring, until the Spanish line finally collapsed with Charles II. But Maria Anna's story was far from unique. Let's move further back in time, to the 14th century, to talk about Joanna of Castile, often called Joanna the Mad. Born in 1479, Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the famous Catholic monarchs who unified Spain and sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Americas. Joanna's parents were themselves related, second cousins who had needed a papal dispensation to marry, and their family trees were already tangled with generations of intermarriage among Spanish and Portuguese royal families. But Joanna's story is particularly tragic because it combines the physical effects of inbreeding with questions about mental health, political manipulation, and the ways royal women could be declared insane when they became inconvenient to the men around them. Ferdinand and Isabella's marriage itself is an important part of this story. Ferdinand was King of Aragon and Isabella was Queen of Castile, and their marriage in 1469 united these two kingdoms, creating the foundation for what would become Spain. But their marriage required a papal dispensation because they were second cousins, both descended from John I of Castile. The dispensation was initially difficult to obtain because of political complications, and there were questions about the validity of the dispensation they eventually used, leading to later concerns about whether their children were legitimate. But these concerns were swept aside by the success of Ferdinand and Isabella's reign, their conquest of Granada, their sponsorship of Columbus, their establishment of the Spanish Inquisition, and their positioning of Spain as a major European power. Joanna was the third child and second daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, born in 1479 in Toledo. She was raised in a devoutly Catholic household with strict discipline and high expectations. Her education was typical for a princess of that era, learning Latin, religion, music, embroidery, and the skills needed to manage a royal household. She was described as intelligent and pious, but also as passionate and strong-willed, traits that would later be interpreted as signs of mental instability. The gap between how passionate women were viewed versus passionate men is significant here. A man who showed strong emotions might be called spirited or decisive, while a woman showing the same emotions would be called hysterical or irrational. Joanna was married in 1496 to Philip the Handsome, Duke of Burgundy and son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. This was another cousin marriage, designed to strengthen the alliance between Spain and the Habsburg territories. Philip was indeed considered handsome by the standards of his time, and accounts suggest that Joanna fell deeply in love with him, perhaps more deeply than was considered proper for a political marriage. She was passionate, emotional, intensely devoted to her husband. When Philip showed interest in other women, which he did frequently, Joanna became jealous and distraught. She once allegedly attacked one of Philip's mistresses, cutting off the woman's hair in a fit of rage. This behavior was seen as evidence of instability, of excessive emotion that couldn't be controlled. The incident with the mistress is worth examining in more detail because it's often cited as proof of Joanna's madness. According to various accounts, Philip was having an affair with a Flemish noblewoman. When Joanna discovered this, she confronted the woman at a court gathering, verbally abusing her and then physically attacking her, cutting off her hair with scissors. In medieval and Renaissance culture, a woman's hair was a symbol of her beauty and virtue, so cutting it off was both a physical assault and a symbolic degradation. Philip was reportedly furious at Joanna for this public scene, and their relationship deteriorated further. But considered objectively, Joanna's behavior, while extreme, was perhaps understandable for a woman who loved her husband deeply, who had been publicly humiliated by his infidelities, and who had no other outlet for her anger and pain. After Joanna's mother, Isabella, died in 1504, Joanna became Queen of Castile. But she never truly got to rule. Her father, Ferdinand, wanted to maintain control over Castile, and her husband, Philip, wanted to rule through her. Joanna was caught between these two men, both of whom saw her as a tool rather than a person. Philip and Ferdinand both spread rumors about Joanna's mental state, suggesting she was too unstable to rule, too emotional, too irrational. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, possibly from typhoid fever, though some suspected poisoning, Joanna's behavior became even more erratic. She refused to be separated from his body, traveling with his coffin, occasionally having it opened so she could see him. This behavior, while perhaps extreme, was interpreted at the time as proof of complete insanity. The famous story of Joanna, traveling with Philip's corpse, has become the defining image of her supposed madness. After Philip died in Burgos, Joanna refused to allow him to be buried immediately. She had his body embalmed and placed in a coffin, which she then took with her as she traveled. According to some accounts, she would have the coffin opened periodically so she could see Philip's body and verify that he was still there. She traveled primarily at night, dressed in mourning clothes, forming a strange and macabre procession through the Spanish countryside. This went on for months, and the stories about Joanna's behavior with the coffin spread throughout Europe, cementing her reputation as mad. But again, we need to consider context. Joanna was in deep grief over the sudden death of the husband she loved passionately. She was also in a desperate political situation. She was Queen of Castile, but both her father and various Spanish nobles were trying to take power from her. Keeping Philip's body with her may have been partly an expression of grief, but it may also have been a political strategy, a way of maintaining some connection to legitimacy and power through her status as Philip's widow. In some accounts, Joanna feared that if she allowed Philip's body to be buried, her enemies would use the burial ceremony as an opportunity to seize power and push her aside. By keeping the body with her, she maintained control over at least that aspect of the situation. Ferdinand used his daughter's grief and strange behavior as justification to take control of Castile, declaring Joanna unfit to rule. She was confined to a convent in Tordesillas, where she would spend the next 46 years of her life, locked away, isolated from her children, kept under guard. During the early years of her confinement, she was treated harshly, denied basic comforts, sometimes chained or physically restrained. Her father and later her son Charles, who became Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, kept her imprisoned because it was politically convenient. If Joanna was insane and unfit to rule, then they could rule in her name without challenge. Whether Joanna was actually mentally ill, or whether she was simply a passionate woman whose grief and anger were weaponized against her, is still debated by historians. The evidence is mixed. Some accounts describe genuine psychological problems, periods of catatonia, refusal to eat or bathe, paranoid delusions. Other accounts suggest a woman whose main crime was loving too intensely and being inconvenient to powerful men. Life at Tordesillas was bleak for Joanna. She was confined to a small apartment in the convent with minimal furnishings and little comfort. She was allowed few visitors, and those visits were supervised. Her correspondence was monitored and often intercepted. She was denied access to news about the outside world and about her children. Guards were posted at her doors and windows. She was essentially a prisoner, though officially she remained Queen of Castile in title. During periods when she refused to eat or bathe, which happened frequently according to some accounts, she would be force-fed and forcibly bathed by attendants. During periods when she was violent or tried to escape, she might be restrained with chains or locked in her room with boarded-up windows. What we do know is that Joanna came from a family with a history of mental instability. Her paternal grandmother, Joanna Enriquez, was described as melancholic and subject to fits of rage. Her maternal grandmother, Isabella of Portugal, suffered from severe mental illness in her later years, refusing to change her clothes and believing herself to be tormented by demons. This pattern suggests that there may have been genetic factors at play, possibly exacerbated by generations of inbreeding. Depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and other mental health conditions can have hereditary components, and when the gene pool is limited by repeated intermarriage, the risk of these conditions appearing increases. But in Joanna's time, mental illness was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized. A royal woman showing signs of psychological distress could easily find herself declared insane and locked away for life. Joanna gave birth to 6 children during her marriage to Philip, and the circumstances of these births were often difficult. She was constantly pregnant or recovering from pregnancy during the years of her marriage, traveling frequently as Philip moved between his various territories, giving birth far from home without the support of her own family. Her first child, Eleanor, was born when Joanna was barely 17. She would have 5 more children over the next 9 years. The constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, and recovery took a physical toll, and Joanna's emotional distress during this period is well documented. She was possessive of her children when they were young, but after Philip's death and her confinement, she was separated from most of them and rarely allowed to see them. Her youngest daughter, Catherine, was confined with her at Tordesillas and kept in similar conditions, another casualty of the family's dynastic politics. Catherine's story is particularly sad because she was essentially imprisoned from childhood, living with her mother in the convent at Tordesillas, deprived of a normal upbringing or education. Catherine was only a few years old when she was confined with Joanna, and she would spend her childhood and adolescence in those grim conditions, with only her mentally ill mother for company much of the time. The guards and attendants who watched over Joanna also controlled Catherine's life. She had minimal education, limited social contact, no opportunity to develop normally. When she was finally allowed to leave Tordesillas in her 20s to marry the King of Portugal, she was reportedly damaged by her years of confinement, lacking in social graces and education, psychologically scarred by the experience. The genetic legacy Joanna passed to her children was complex. Her son Charles became one of the most powerful rulers in European history, controlling Spain, the Low Countries, parts of Italy, Austria, and vast territories in the Americas. But he also inherited the Habsburg jaw, that pronounced underbite that would become more severe in later generations. He suffered from gout, digestive problems, and other health issues throughout his life. Her daughter Isabella married Christian II of Denmark and Norway, but died young, at 34, after a life marked by political turmoil and exile. Several of Joanna's grandchildren and great-grandchildren showed signs of the accumulating genetic burden of Habsburg intermarriage, problems that would reach their peak several generations later. Charles V's reign and abdication are significant in this story. Charles became Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, ruler of the Burgundian territories, and lord of vast colonial possessions in the Americas and Asia. He spent his reign dealing with the Protestant Reformation, wars with France and the Ottoman Empire, managing his sprawling territories, and trying to maintain Habsburg power. But he was plagued by health problems throughout his life, suffering from gout so severe that he sometimes couldn't walk, digestive issues that made eating painful, hemorrhoids, epilepsy, and chronic pain. Modern analysis of his symptoms suggests he may have inherited a metabolic disorder that caused many of these problems, possibly porphyria or another condition that was concentrated in his family through inbreeding. In 1556, exhausted by his health problems and the challenges of ruling his vast domains, Charles abdicated his various thrones and retired to a monastery in Spain. He divided his territories between his brother Ferdinand, who received the Austrian lands and the title of Holy Roman Emperor, and his son Philip, who received Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and the overseas territories. Charles spent his final years in relative seclusion, focusing on his religious devotions, trying various treatments for his ailments, and dying in 1558 at age 58. His decision to abdicate was highly unusual for the time and reflected both his personal exhaustion and his recognition that the Habsburg Empire was becoming unmanageable. Joanna died in 1555 at the age of 75, having spent the majority of her adult life imprisoned in Tordesillas. She outlived her husband by 49 years, outlived her father, outlived most of her children, spent decades in a small apartment with barred windows, seeing the same walls day after day. Whether she was truly mad or simply a woman destroyed by circumstances, grief, and the political machinations of the men in her life, her story is one of the most tragic in medieval and Renaissance history. She was born into a world where her only value was in the alliances she could forge and the children she could produce. And when she failed to play her role in the expected way, she was discarded and forgotten by everyone, except the guards who kept her locked away. Let's shift our focus now to another family, the Ptolemies of ancient Egypt, because while they're not medieval in the strict sense, their practice of inbreeding was so extreme and went on for so long that their story provides important context for understanding later European practices. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, from 323 BC to 30 BC, and they had a very specific marriage custom that made European royal inbreeding look modest by comparison. The Ptolemies regularly practiced full sibling marriage. Brothers married sisters, not cousins or second cousins, but full biological siblings sharing both parents. This wasn't occasional or in response to specific political needs. This was standard practice, the expected and preferred form of royal marriage. The origins of the Ptolemaic dynasty go back to the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire and Egypt, creating one of the largest empires in ancient history, but he died young at 32 without a clear heir. His generals, known as the Diadochi or successors, fought among themselves for control of different parts of the empire. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest friends and most capable generals, secured control of Egypt and declared himself pharaoh, beginning the Ptolemaic dynasty. Ptolemy I and his successors ruled Egypt as Greek pharaohs, combining Greek and Egyptian customs, patronizing Greek culture, while presenting themselves as legitimate Egyptian rulers to their subjects. The Ptolemaic practice of sibling marriage was influenced by Egyptian custom. The ancient Egyptian pharaohs had sometimes married their sisters, though how common this practice actually was is debated among historians. The Ptolemies, seeking to legitimize their rule and present themselves as true pharaohs rather than foreign conquerors, adopted this practice and made it systematic. But they also had pragmatic political reasons for sibling marriage. By marrying brothers to sisters within the royal family, they kept all power concentrated in their own hands, prevented the rise of rival claimants who might come from marriages to outside families, and maintained what they believed was the purity and superiority of their royal blood. The most famous Ptolemaic woman, of course, is Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra was the product of generations of sibling marriage. Her parents were Ptolemy XII and probably Cleopatra V, though her mother's identity isn't completely certain. What is certain is that Cleopatra VII's family tree was severely compressed. If you chart it out, you find that she had far fewer unique ancestors than a person with no inbreeding would have. Going back just a few generations, the same names appear in multiple positions. Her great-great-great-grandparents were Ptolemy V and Cleopatra I, and they appear multiple times in her ancestry through different lines of descent. The genetic implications of this level of inbreeding should have been catastrophic. And indeed, many Ptolemaic rulers showed signs of health problems, physical weakness, and mental instability. Ptolemy II, who ruled in the 3rd century BC, married his full sister Arsinoe II, setting the pattern for subsequent generations. This marriage was celebrated publicly, with Arsinoe being deified alongside her brother husband, given divine honors, and having cities named after her. The Ptolemies justified sibling marriage through religious ideology, claiming divine status, similar to the Egyptian gods Osiris and Isis, who were also siblings and spouses in mythology. This religious justification made the practice acceptable to their Egyptian subjects, while also serving the political purpose of keeping power concentrated within the immediate royal family. The pattern continued through the dynasty with remarkable consistency. Ptolemy IV married his sister Arsinoe III. Ptolemy VI married his sister Cleopatra II. Ptolemy VIII married both of his sisters at different times, first Cleopatra II, and then, after her death, Cleopatra III, who was both his sister and his niece, being the daughter of his brother and his first wife's sister. The family relationships became so tangled that keeping track of who was related to whom requires careful study of genealogical charts. The same names were reused repeatedly, with multiple Ptolemies and Cleopatras in each generation, making the situation even more confusing for historians trying to sort out the relationships. What's remarkable about Cleopatra VII is that she seems to have been relatively healthy and highly intelligent despite her genetic burden. Ancient sources describe her as charismatic, multilingual, politically astute, and physically attractive, though not necessarily the transcendent beauty that later legends would make her. How did she escape the worst effects of inbreeding that should have plagued her? There are a few possible explanations. First, there's evidence that the Ptolemies occasionally married outside the immediate family, bringing in some genetic diversity, even if they didn't advertise these marriages widely. Cleopatra's own mother might have been a concubine rather than an official wife, possibly bringing in some fresh genetic material. Second, natural selection may have been at work in a brutal way. The Ptolemaic royal family had high rates of infant mortality, childhood death, and early adult death. Those who survived to adulthood and took the throne might have been the ones who, by chance, inherited fewer problematic gene combinations. The weakest died young, and only the relatively stronger individuals made it through. The historical record shows that many Ptolemaic children died young or showed signs of serious health problems. Ptolemy IV's son, Ptolemy V, was described as sickly and died at age 28. Ptolemy VI's children included several who died in childhood. Ptolemy VIII had numerous children from multiple wives, but many died young. The pattern of high mortality suggests that the genetic burden was indeed taking its toll, with only a fraction of the children born to Ptolemaic royalty surviving to adulthood in good health. The ones who did survive and rule were the lucky exceptions, not the norm. But even Cleopatra couldn't escape all the consequences of her heritage. She followed the family tradition by marrying her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, when she was about 18 and he was about 10. This was a political marriage required by her father's will and by Egyptian tradition, but it was troubled from the start. Ptolemy XIII was apparently intellectually limited and easily manipulated by his advisors, who opposed Cleopatra's attempts to rule. Whether his limitations were due to the family's genetic burden, his youth, or other factors is unclear, but Cleopatra quickly found herself in conflict with her brother-husband and his supporters. This led to civil war, to Cleopatra's famous relationship with Julius Caesar, and eventually to her brother's death by drowning during the Battle of the Nile. The conflict between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII reveals the tensions inherent in the Ptolemaic system of brother-sister co-rule. In theory, the siblings would rule together, sharing power equally. In practice, ambitious individuals on both sides would compete for dominance, leading to civil wars and political instability. Cleopatra was clearly more intelligent and capable than her younger brother, but his advisors, particularly the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achillas, and the rhetoric teacher Theodotus, used the boy king as a figurehead for their own power. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BC, pursuing his rival Pompey, Cleopatra saw an opportunity to gain a powerful ally against her brother. She famously had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence rolled up in a carpet, impressing the Roman general with her boldness and intelligence. After Ptolemy XIII's death, Cleopatra married her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, continuing the tradition of sibling marriage. But this marriage was clearly a political formality. Cleopatra was actually living with Julius Caesar at this point and had given birth to his son, Caesarion. When Caesar returned to Rome, Cleopatra followed him there, living openly as his mistress, scandalizing Roman society. After Caesar's assassination, she returned to Egypt, and Ptolemy XIV died shortly after, possibly murdered on Cleopatra's orders, though this is disputed. She then made Caesarion her co-ruler, and later became involved with Mark Antony, having 3 children with him. Her story is famous. The military conflicts with Rome, the political intrigues, the dramatic suicide with an asp after the defeat at Actium. But what's often overlooked is how her life was shaped by the Ptolemaic tradition of inbreeding, how she was forced into marriages with her own brothers as part of maintaining the family's dynastic claims. Cleopatra's relationship with Mark Antony produced 3 children, twins named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and a younger son named Ptolemy Philadelphus. These children represented a break from the Ptolemaic pattern of inbreeding because their father was Roman, bringing in entirely new genetic material. After Cleopatra's death and the Roman conquest of Egypt, the children were taken to Rome and raised by Octavia, Mark Antony's Roman wife. Cleopatra Selene later married Juba II of Mauritania and became queen of that kingdom, surviving and thriving in a way that many products of Ptolemaic inbreeding did not. Her success suggests that the genetic diversity from her Roman father may have benefited her health and capabilities. The Ptolemaic dynasty ended with Cleopatra. After her death, and the death of Caesarion, who was murdered on Octavian's orders, there were no more Ptolemies to rule Egypt. The family had essentially bred itself into a genetic dead end. Nearly 300 years of sibling marriage had produced a line that, while it lasted longer than anyone might expect given the level of inbreeding, finally collapsed. The last generation was marked by civil wars, political instability, and the inability to defend against Roman expansion. While many factors contributed to the dynasty's end, the biological weakness caused by centuries of inbreeding surely played a role. A healthier, more genetically diverse royal family might have produced more capable rulers, more viable heirs, a more stable succession. The fall of Egypt to Rome marked the end of the Hellenistic age and the beginning of the Roman domination of the Mediterranean world. It also marked the end of one of history's most extreme experiments in royal inbreeding. The Ptolemaic practice of sibling marriage had lasted for nearly 3 centuries, producing a dynasty of rulers who governed one of the richest and most culturally significant regions of the ancient world. But it was ultimately unsustainable. The genetic problems accumulated over generations. The family became increasingly unstable politically and biologically, and when they finally faced a stronger enemy in Rome, they couldn't mount an effective defense. Returning to medieval Europe, we need to talk about the later Habsburgs in more detail, because this is where the consequences of inbreeding became most visible and best documented. Charles II of Spain, who lived from 1661 to 1700, was the product of so much inbreeding that his coefficient of inbreeding, a measure of how related someone's parents are, was higher than if his parents had been full siblings. This wasn't because his parents, Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, were full siblings, they weren't, but because they were uncle and niece, and because both of them were themselves products of generations of Habsburg intermarriage. When geneticists have reconstructed Charles's family tree, they've found that he had far fewer unique ancestors than he should have had. Going back several generations, the same individuals appear over and over in different positions on the tree. Charles's mother, Mariana of Austria, deserves particular attention because her life illustrates the experience of women in these inbred royal lines. She was born in 1634, the daughter of Maria Anna of Spain, the same Maria Anna we discussed earlier, and Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. So Mariana was already the product of a cousin marriage, and her own ancestry was tangled with Habsburg intermarriages. In 1649, when she was just 15 years old, she was betrothed to her uncle, Philip IV of Spain, who was 44 years old at the time and had recently been widowed. This marriage between uncle and niece was arranged to keep the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family closely connected, to ensure that Spanish territories and wealth would remain in Habsburg hands. The circumstances of this marriage arrangement reveal the cold political calculations involved. Philip IV had been married to Elizabeth of France, who died in 1644 after 25 years of marriage. Philip needed a new wife to produce more heirs because his only surviving son from his first marriage, Balthasar Charles, had died in 1646 at age 16. Philip's advisors looked around for a suitable bride and decided that his own niece, Mariana, would be ideal. She was young, fertile, of unimpeachable Habsburg blood, and the marriage would strengthen the family's unity. The fact that Philip was nearly 3 times Mariana's age, that he was her uncle, that the marriage would produce yet another generation of severely inbred children, none of this outweighed the political advantages. Mariana arrived in Spain and married Philip, becoming queen at 15 to a man nearly 3 times her age. She would spend the next 16 years pregnant repeatedly, giving birth to 5 children, though only 2 survived to adulthood. Her first child, born when she was just 16, lived only 4 years. Her second child, a daughter named Margaret, survived to adulthood but was physically frail and showed some signs of developmental delays. Her third child lived less than a year. Her fourth child, Philip, died at age 4. And then, in 1661, when Mariana was 27, she gave birth to Charles, the son who would eventually become Charles II. The pattern of child mortality in Mariana's pregnancies is striking and tragic. Of 5 children born alive, only 2 survived past early childhood, and one of those survivors, Charles, was severely disabled. This 40% survival rate was actually not unusual for royal families of that era, but it represented an enormous emotional burden for Mariana. Each pregnancy carried hope that this child would be healthy, would survive, would thrive. Each birth was followed by the constant worry that the child would sicken and die, as so many royal children did. And when the children did die, Mariana had to grieve, compose herself, and prepare to become pregnant again, over and over, in a cycle that must have been emotionally devastating. Charles's birth was apparently difficult, and from the beginning it was clear that something was wrong with him. He had the most extreme version of the Habsburg jaw ever recorded in the family, so severe that he couldn't chew food properly and could barely speak clearly. His tongue was too large for his mouth, adding to his speech difficulties. He was constantly drooling and had chronic digestive problems because he couldn't properly chew his food. He learned to walk very late, at age 5 or 6, and was intellectually disabled, described by contemporaries as learning slowly and understanding little. He was susceptible to infections and illnesses, suffering repeatedly from what were probably simple childhood diseases that his immune system couldn't effectively fight off. He had rickets, causing bone deformities. He had an enlarged head, possibly indicating hydrophilus. He was described as weak, sickly, and as he grew older, prone to seizures. The daily reality of Charles's existence must have been one of constant discomfort and frustration. Unable to eat normally, he would have been hungry much of the time, struggling to consume enough food to sustain himself. Unable to speak clearly, he would have difficulty communicating his needs and thoughts, leading to isolation and misunderstanding. Unable to walk properly until late childhood, he would have been dependent on servants to carry him and move him around. Subject to frequent illnesses, he would have spent much of his time feeling unwell, in pain, feverish, exhausted. And his intellectual disabilities meant that he couldn't fully understand his own condition or why he was different from other people. Contemporary accounts of Charles are often harsh, describing him in terms that emphasize his physical repulsiveness and mental limitations. One ambassador, described him as having a head full of water, being unable to stand upright without support, having a tongue so large he could barely speak or swallow his saliva. Another account mentioned that he looked like a ghost, pale and weak, with no life in his eyes. These descriptions, while reflecting the observer's honest impressions, also reveal the lack of sympathy or understanding for someone with severe disabilities. Charles was judged by his inability to function as a normal king should function, with little consideration for the fact that his condition was entirely the result of his family's genetic choices, not any failing of his own. Mariana became regent of Spain when Philip IV died in 1665, ruling in young Charles's name. She held this position for 10 years until Charles was declared of age to rule on his own in 1675, though even after that she remained a powerful influence. Her regency was marked by continued political and military decline for Spain, by economic problems, by losing wars and territories to France and other rivals. Some of this was beyond her control, the result of decades of Spanish overextension and mismanagement, but her rule wasn't particularly effective either. She was caught between competing factions of nobles and advisors, and her primary focus was always on protecting her son's position and trying to secure his succession. The political situation during Mariana's regency was extremely difficult. Spain was in decline from its earlier position as the dominant European power. The economy was suffering from inflation caused by the influx of silver from American mines, mismanagement of finances, expensive wars, and the expulsion of productive Jewish and Morisco populations in earlier generations. The military was overstretched, trying to maintain control over territories in the Netherlands, Italy, and elsewhere while fighting wars with France and dealing with rebellions. The government was corrupt and inefficient, with various factions competing for power and enriching themselves at the expense of the state. And presiding over all of this was a regency for a severely disabled child king, creating uncertainty about the future and encouraging Spain's enemies to take advantage of the situation. Mariana herself was not particularly well equipped to handle these challenges. She had no training in governance, having been married at 15 and thrust into the role of queen and then regent without preparation. She relied heavily on advisors, but chose poorly, favoring her Jesuit confessor Johann Everard Nithard, an Austrian, who was wildly unpopular with Spanish nobles. When Nithard's influence became too controversial, Mariana was forced to dismiss him and replace him with Fernando de Valenzuela, who was even more corrupt and incompetent. These bad choices undermined her regency and made it easier for her opponents to challenge her authority. When Charles was declared of age in 1675, there was a palace coup led by Charles's illegitimate half-brother John of Austria, who forced Mariana into exile and took control of the government himself. The succession was Mariana's great problem, because Charles, despite being king, seemed unlikely to produce heirs. He was married twice. First to Marie-Louise of Orleans, and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg, but both marriages were childless. Contemporary accounts suggest that Charles was probably impotent, unable to consummate his marriages, though this was a closely guarded secret and the subject of much speculation and rumor. Various explanations were offered, from witchcraft to curses to medical problems, but the reality was almost certainly that his severe genetic problems extended to his reproductive system. Mariana spent years worrying about the succession, trying to arrange political alliances to protect Spain after Charles's death, knowing that the Habsburg line in Spain would end with her son. The issue of Charles's potential fertility became a major political question. If he could produce an heir, the Habsburg dynasty in Spain would continue. If he couldn't, the throne would pass to some relative, probably from the Austrian Habsburg branch or from the French Bourbon branch, both of which had claims through earlier marriages. Every faction at court had an interest in the question. Doctors were brought in to examine Charles and suggest treatments. His diet was modified. Various potions and remedies were administered, prayers were said, pilgrimages were made to holy sites. Nothing worked because the problem wasn't medical in any treatable sense. Charles's body was simply too damaged by genetic problems to function normally in this respect. Charles II finally died in 1700, just before his 39th birthday, probably from a combination of his many chronic health problems. He had suffered from edema, seizures, and repeated infections in his final years. The autopsy report is famous among medical historians for its catalog of health problems. His body was described as containing not a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines were putrid and gangrenous, he had a single testicle which was black as coal, and his head was full of water. While some of these descriptions might be exaggerated or misinterpreted, the overall picture is clear. Charles II was a physical wreck, barely able to survive, let alone function as an effective ruler or produce children. His death ended the Habsburg dynasty in Spain and led to the War of Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict over who would take the Spanish throne. The War of Spanish Succession lasted from 1700 to 1713 and involved most of the major European powers. On one side were France and Spain, supporting the claim of Philip of Anjou, a grandson of Louis XIV of France who became Philip V of Spain. On the other side were Austria, England, the Netherlands, and various German states, supporting the claim of Archduke Charles of Austria, who later became Charles VI, Holy Roman Empire. The war was fought across Europe and in colonial territories, causing enormous destruction and loss of life. It ended with Philip V recognized as King of Spain, but with various territorial concessions to the other powers, including Spain giving up its territories in Italy and the Netherlands. The war fundamentally reshaped the European balance of power and marked the end of Spanish dominance and the rise of British and French power. Mariana of Austria had died 3 years before Charles in 1696 at the age of 64. She had spent her life serving the Habsburg dynasty, marrying her uncle, producing heirs under difficult circumstances, ruling as regent, trying to manage an empire in decline, watching her surviving children struggle with the consequences of their genetic burden. Her daughter Margaret married the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, another Habsburg cousin marriage, and had several children, but she died young, at just 22, possibly from complications following the birth of her last child. Of Mariana's 5 children, only Margaret lived long enough to have children of her own, and Charles lived to adulthood but died childless. This was the reality for women in severely inbred royal lines: repeated pregnancies, frequent loss of children, the constant stress of dynastic expectations, and often their own health problems from the genetic burden they carried.
Another woman whose life was shaped by Habsburg inbreeding was Maria Theresa of Spain, who lived from 1638 to 1683.
She was the daughter of Philip IV of Spain and his first wife, Elizabeth of France, making her Charles II's half-sister, much older than him and from Philip's first marriage. Maria Theresa was married to Louis XIV of France in 1660, part of the Treaty of the Pyrenees that ended a long war between France and Spain. This was one of the few Habsburg marriages that brought in some genetic diversity, as Louis XIV was not closely related to the Habsburgs, though he was Maria Theresa's first cousin through their mothers, who were sisters. Still, this was one of the less inbred marriages in Maria Theresa's family history. The Treaty of the Pyrenees and the marriage arrangement that was part of it represented a major shift in European power dynamics. Spain, weakened by decades of war and internal decline, had to make peace with France on unfavorable terms. Part of the treaty involved Maria Theresa marrying Louis XIV with the understanding that she would renounce her claims to the Spanish throne in exchange for a large dowry. However, Spain never fully paid the dowry, which later gave Louis an excuse to claim Spanish territories for his wife, leading to more wars. The marriage was meant to cement peace between the two kingdoms, but it actually created new tensions and conflicts that would persist for decades. Maria Theresa spent 23 years as Queen of France, living at the French court, bearing 6 children, though only one survived to adulthood. She was reportedly pious, kind, and devoted to her husband, though Louis was notoriously unfaithful, maintaining a series of official mistresses throughout their marriage. Maria Theresa accepted this situation with resignation, apparently believing that challenging her husband's behavior would be inappropriate and futile. She focused on her religious devotions and her children, trying to be a good Catholic queen despite the humiliations of her husband's public infidelities. Contemporary accounts describe her as short and rather plain, though this might be partially due to French courtiers looking down on their Spanish queen. She never fully mastered French, speaking it with a heavy Spanish accent, and she reportedly preferred Spanish food and customs to French ones. Life at the French court for Maria Theresa was in many ways a form of exile. She was surrounded by a culture that was different from the one she had known in Spain, speaking a language that was not her native tongue, following customs that were unfamiliar. The French courtiers, proud and conscious of their own sophistication, looked down on the Spanish princess as provincial and unsophisticated. Louis XIV's mother, Anne of Austria, was also Spanish, so there was some family connection and support, but Anne died in 1666, just 6 years after Maria Theresa's arrival, leaving the young queen more isolated. Maria Theresa's apartments at Versailles were magnificent, but they were also a gilded cage, a place where she could practice her devotions, receive formal visits, and endure her husband's infidelities with quiet dignity. Louis XIV's mistresses were a constant source of humiliation for Maria Theresa. The French court had a tradition of official royal mistresses, a situation that was publicly acknowledged and even celebrated. Louis's first major mistress was Louise de la Vallière, followed by Madame de Montespan and later Madame de Maintenon, whom Louis secretly married after Maria Theresa's death. These women lived at court, were given apartments near the king, received titles and honors, and their children by the king were acknowledged and legitimized. Maria Theresa had to see these women regularly, had to watch her husband show them attention and affection while treating her as primarily a duty. She reportedly once said to Madame de Montespan, "You may have his heart, but I have his hand," referring to her status as the legitimate queen, even though the mistress had the king's affection. What's significant about Maria Theresa from a genetic perspective is that she carried Habsburg traits despite having one non-Habsburg parent. She had a noticeable, though not severe, version of the Habsburg jaw, and she passed this trait on to some of her children. Most of her children died young, within days or weeks of birth, or in early childhood. The only one who survived to adulthood was Louis, the Grand Dauphin, who became heir to the French throne. He inherited some Habsburg features from his mother, but was generally healthier than his Spanish cousins, benefiting from the genetic diversity brought in through his father's side. However, the Grand Dauphin himself would die before his father, never becoming king, and the French succession would eventually pass to the Grand Dauphin's son, who became Louis XV. The Grand Dauphin, despite his better genetic background compared to the Spanish Habsburgs, still showed some health problems. He was obese, which might have had genetic components or might have been purely lifestyle-related. He was not particularly intelligent or ambitious, content to live comfortably and pursue pleasures rather than preparing seriously to rule. When he died suddenly in 1711 at age 49, possibly from smallpox, it created a succession crisis because his eldest son, Louis, Duke of Burgundy, had already died the previous year. The succession eventually passed to Louis, Duke of Burgundy's son, who became Louis XV at age 5, requiring a long regency. This succession of unexpected deaths demonstrates the fragility of royal lines, even when genetic diversity is somewhat better than in the most inbred families. Maria Theresa died in 1683 at age 44 from an abscess in her arm that became infected. In an age before antibacteria, such infections were often fatal. Her death was mourned by Louis XIV, who reportedly said that this was the first trouble she had ever given him, a backhanded compliment suggesting that she had been an uncomplaining, dutiful wife who never challenged him or caused problems. She had spent her life doing what was expected of royal women, marrying for political reasons, bearing children, maintaining proper behavior, supporting her husband despite his personal failings, and practicing ostentatious piety. The fact that most of her children died young was seen as tragic, but not particularly unusual for the time. The connection between these deaths and her Habsburg genetic heritage wasn't understood. The children who died young in Maria Theresa's and Louis's marriage included Anne Elizabeth, born and died in 1662, Marie Anne, born and died in 1664, Marie Therese, born and died in 1667, Philippe Charles, who lived from 1668 to 1671, and Louis François, who lived from 1672 to 1672. Each of these deaths would have been a devastating loss for Maria Theresa, each pregnancy a hope that ended in grief. The only child who survived, the Grand Dauphin, was born in 1661, the year after their marriage, suggesting that perhaps the firstborn had benefited from younger parental age and better maternal health before the toll of repeated pregnancies began to accumulate. We should also discuss Isabella of Portugal, who lived from 1503 to 1539 and was the wife of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor who was also Charles I of Spain. Isabella was the daughter of Manuel I of Portugal and Maria of Aragon, and while she wasn't a Habsburg by birth, she married into the family, and her story illustrates how women from other royal lines were brought into the Habsburg genetic pool. Isabella was actually Charles V's first cousin. Her mother and Charles's mother were sisters, both daughters of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. So this was another cousin marriage, typical of the pattern we're discussing. Isabella's family background is worth examining. Her father, Manuel I of Portugal, had an extraordinarily complex marital history that illustrates the tangled web of Iberian royal marriages. He was first married to Isabella of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, and older sister of Joanna the Mad. When Isabella died in childbirth, Manuel married her younger sister, Maria of Aragon, who became Isabella of Portugal's mother. So Isabella of Portugal's mother and aunt were sisters who both married the same man, her father. This kind of arrangement, where a man married two sisters in succession, was not uncommon in royal families, seen as a way to maintain the same political alliance while providing the man with a new wife after the death of the first. Isabella and Charles were apparently genuinely fond of each other, unusual for a political marriage of that era. Charles chose to spend considerable time with Isabella rather than constantly traveling among his many territories, which was remarkable given his responsibilities as Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, and ruler of vast other territories. Isabella served as regent of Spain when Charles was absent, demonstrating considerable political skill. She managed Spanish affairs, dealt with the Cortes, the Spanish Parliament, and worked to maintain stability in the kingdom while her husband was dealing with wars, religious conflicts, and political challenges across Europe. She bore 6 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood, a better survival rate than many royal women achieved, but still reflecting the high child mortality of the time. Isabella's role as regent demonstrates that royal women could be politically capable and effective when given the opportunity. She handled complex negotiations, made decisions about taxation and military matters, corresponded with her husband about policy issues, and generally managed to keep Spain stable during Charles's frequent absences. Some contemporary accounts praised her wisdom and judgment, noting that she often provided good advice to Charles and helped moderate some of his more impulsive decisions. Her success as regent makes one wonder how many other royal women could have been effective rulers if they had been given the chance, rather than being confined to purely ceremonial roles or locked away when they became inconvenient. Isabella's life was cut short when she died at age 35 from complications following a miscarriage. She had been pregnant with her 7th child when she miscarried, developed a fever, and died within days. Charles was devastated by her death and never remarried, unusual for a king who needed to produce heirs. He wore black for the rest of his life in mourning. Isabella's children included Philip II, who would become King of Spain and continue the Habsburg pattern of close family marriages, eventually marrying his niece Maria Manuela and later marrying 3 more times, always choosing wives from closely related families. Isabella's daughter Maria married her cousin Maximilian II, continuing the pattern of Habsburg intermarriage into the next generation. The circumstances of Isabella's death reflect the dangers of repeated pregnancies. By the time of her fatal miscarriage, she had already been through 6 previous pregnancies and births, her body stressed by the constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, and recovery. The miscarriage itself might have been caused by any number of factors, including genetic abnormalities in the fetus, but what killed Isabella was the infection that followed. Puerperal fever, infection of the uterus after miscarriage or childbirth, was one of the leading causes of death for women of childbearing age in this era. The connection between poor hygiene and infection wouldn't be understood for another 300 years, so nothing was done to prevent the introduction of infectious organisms during the miscarriage or to treat the infection once it began. What's notable about Isabella's story is how capable and politically skilled she was, demonstrating that intelligence and ability weren't always compromised by the genetic burden of royal inbreeding, at least not in the earlier generations before the effects had fully accumulated. But her early death from childbirth complications was typical of the dangers faced by all women of her era, dangers that were arguably increased by repeated pregnancies and by any genetic factors that might have affected her health. Royal women were expected to produce heirs continuously, pregnancy after pregnancy, with little time for their bodies to recover between births. This constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, nursing, and pregnancy again took an enormous physical toll. Her funeral was conducted with full imperial honors, and Charles commissioned numerous masses to be said for her soul. He also commissioned a portrait of Isabella that he kept with him for the rest of his life, looking at it during his final years in the monastery where he retired. Their relationship appears to have been one of the few genuine love matches among royal marriages of that era, making her death even more poignant. Charles's decision never to remarry, despite the political and dynastic pressure to do so, suggests the depth of his grief and his genuine attachment to Isabella. Another tragic figure was Maria Anna of Neuburg, who lived from 1667 to 1740 and was the second wife of Charles II of Spain. We mentioned her earlier, but she deserves more attention because her experience illuminates the desperation surrounding Charles's inability to produce heirs. Maria Anna was from a German noble family, the daughter of Philip William, Elector Palatine. She married Charles in 1690 when she was 23 and he was 28. At this point, Charles had been married to his first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, for 10 years without producing any children. Marie-Louise had died suddenly in 1689, possibly from appendicitis, though some suspected poison, and Charles needed a new wife immediately to continue trying for an heir. The selection of Maria Anna as Charles's second wife involved extensive negotiations and political calculations. Various European powers had an interest in who would become Queen of Spain because the succession question was becoming urgent. France wanted someone who would be sympathetic to French interests. Austria wanted someone who would support Austrian Habsburg claims. The Palatinate, where Maria Anna came from, was a smaller power looking to increase its influence. Ultimately, Maria Anna was chosen as a compromise candidate, someone from a respectable noble family, but not closely aligned with any of the major powers. She brought a substantial dowry and the hope, forlorn as it turned out, that she might be able to produce the heir that Charles desperately needed. Maria Anna arrived in Spain to find herself married to a man who was physically repulsive by the standards of any era and unable to fulfill the basic functions of a husband. Charles couldn't speak clearly because of his deformed jaw and oversized tongue. He drooled constantly. He could barely walk and often needed assistance. He had seizures. His personal hygiene was apparently poor, possibly because he lacked the physical coordination to maintain it properly. And despite all the pressure and all the attempts, he couldn't produce children. Maria Anna spent 10 years in this marriage, 10 years of humiliation and frustration, knowing that everyone at court blamed her for the lack of heirs, even though the problem was clearly with Charles.
10 years of political maneuvering as various factions tried to position themselves for the succession that would come when Charles inevitably died childless. Maria Anna's daily life at the Spanish court must have been extraordinarily difficult. She was constantly observed and judged, with courtiers watching for any sign that she might be pregnant. Every month that passed without a pregnancy was another disappointment, another round of whispers and speculation about whose fault it was. She had to maintain the pretense that the marriage was normal, that she and Charles had a proper relationship, even though everyone knew the truth. She had to navigate the complex politics of the Spanish court, where various factions were already jockeying for position in anticipation of Charles's death and the succession crisis that would follow. And she had to do all of this far from her home and family, in a foreign country whose language and customs were unfamiliar. The Spanish court tried everything to help Charles produce an heir. Doctors were consulted and gave various treatments, none of which worked. Prayers were said constantly. Exorcisms were performed because some believed Charles was under a curse or possessed by demons. Maria Anna was subjected to examinations and treatments, invasive and humiliating procedures based on medieval medical theories about fertility. But nothing worked because the problem wasn't medical treatment or curses. It was that Charles was biologically incapable of reproduction, the final result of generations of Habsburg inbreeding. When Charles finally died in 1700, Maria Anna was free, but she was also in a difficult position. She was the Dowager Queen of Spain, but Spain was now engulfed in the War of Spanish Succession. She initially supported the claim of Archduke Charles of Austria to the Spanish throne and stayed in Spain. But as the war progressed and it became clear that Philip of Bourbon would become the new king, her position became untenable. The exorcisms performed on Charles II are worth examining in more detail because they reveal the desperation of the Spanish court and the complete lack of understanding about the true nature of his problems. In 1698, 2 years before Charles's death, a major exorcism was performed by a priest who claimed that Charles was possessed by demons who were preventing him from producing an heir. The priest, Father Froilan Diaz, claimed to have identified multiple demons possessing the king, each with specific names and purposes. According to his account, these demons had been sent by enemies of Spain, possibly through witchcraft, to destroy the Habsburg line. The exorcism ritual involved prayers, holy water, relics, and various religious ceremonies designed to drive out the demons. Predictably, it accomplished nothing except to further exhaust and terrify Charles, who by this point was already extremely fragile both physically and mentally. Maria Anna eventually left Spain in 1706, returning to her homeland in Germany. She lived for another 34 years, never remarrying, spending her later years in relative obscurity. She had entered into the marriage expecting to become the mother of future Spanish kings, to play an important role in European politics, to be remembered as a significant historical figure. Instead, she spent 10 years married to a man who couldn't be a husband in any real sense, was blamed for a childlessness that wasn't her fault, and ended up as a footnote in history, remembered mainly for being Charles II's second wife. Her story illustrates the precarious position of royal women, whose entire lives could be determined by circumstances beyond their control, who could be brought from distant lands to fulfill a role that turned out to be impossible, and who had no recourse when the situation proved intolerable.
After leaving Spain, Maria Ana settled in Guadalajara, Spain, for a few years during the War of Spanish Succession, maintaining her support for the Austrian claimant to the throne. When the war turned against the Austrian cause, she finally left Spain permanently in 1706, moving to various locations in the Holy Roman Empire. She lived on her dowry and income from various properties, maintaining a small court, corresponding with other members of European nobility, but never again playing a significant political role. She outlived Charles by 40 years, dying in 1740 at age 72, having spent more than half her life as a widow, living with the memories of those 10 difficult years in Spain when she had been trapped in an impossible situation. Moving to a different family and a different part of Europe, we need to discuss the Portuguese royal family, particularly Maria I of Portugal, who lived from 1734 to 1816, and whose life was marked by both the political pressures of being a ruling queen and the mental illness that eventually consumed her. Maria was the daughter of Joseph I of Portugal and his wife Mariana Victoria of Spain, so right away we see another connection to Spanish royalty and the tangled web of European royal intermarriage. Mariana Victoria was herself a member of the Spanish Bourbon dynasty that had replaced the Habsburgs in Spain, but the Bourbons continued many of the same practices of close family marriage that the Habsburgs had followed. The Bourbon dynasty in Spain began with Philip V, who was a grandson of Louis XIV of France and who gained the Spanish throne as a result of the War of Spanish Succession. The Bourbons brought French administrative practices and cultural influences to Spain, but they also brought French dynastic practices, which included plenty of cousin marriages and close family alliances. Philip V himself married twice, first to Maria Louisa of Savoy, and then, after her death, to Elizabeth Farnese. Both marriages produced numerous children, and these children were married off to various European royals, always with an eye toward maintaining and expanding Bourbon power. The result was another generation of intermarried royal families, with the same names appearing repeatedly in different family trees. Maria I married her uncle, Pedro III, in 1760 when she was 25 and he was 42. This uncle-niece marriage was typical of Portuguese royal practice, designed to keep power and wealth within the family. Maria and Pedro had 6 children, though 2 died in infancy. Maria became queen in 1777 when her father died, ruling jointly with her husband until Pedro's death in 1786, after which she ruled alone. She was initially an effective ruler, implementing reforms, supporting the arts and sciences, working to modernize Portugal and its colonial empire. But beginning in the 1790s, Maria began showing signs of severe mental illness. Maria's early reign showed considerable promise. She reversed some of the more extreme policies of her father's minister, the Marquis of Pombal, who had ruled Portugal as a virtual dictator during Joseph I's reign. She recalled exiles, released political prisoners, and tried to rule in a more moderate and balanced way. She was personally pious and supported the church, rebuilding its influence after Pombal had curtailed it. She promoted education and cultural development, patronizing artists and scientists. She worked to improve Portugal's economy and strengthen its colonial administration in Brazil and other territories. For the first 15 years or so of her reign, Maria was a competent and generally successful monarch.
The symptoms started with melancholy and anxiety, which progressed to what contemporary accounts describe as religious mania, violent fits, hallucinations, and periods of complete withdrawal from reality. Maria believed she was damned, that she was going to hell, that demons were tormenting her. She would scream for hours, refuse food, refuse to change her clothes, or allow anyone to touch her. She had hallucinations of her dead husband and her dead confessor, both of whom she believed were suffering in hell and calling out to her. The court tried various treatments, from bloodletting to cold baths to restraints, none of which helped. By 1792, Maria was clearly unable to rule, and her son John was made Prince Regent, ruling in her name, though she remained queen in title until her death. The progression of Maria's mental illness can be traced through contemporary accounts and official documents. In 1790, she began having episodes of weeping and expressing fears about her salvation. By 1791, she was having more frequent and severe episodes, sometimes screaming that she could see hell opening before her. In 1792, she attacked one of her ladies-in-waiting, believing the woman was a demon in disguise. She began refusing to attend to any governmental duties, refusing to sign documents or see ministers. The Council of State officially recognized that she was incapable of governing and appointed her son John as Prince Regent. From that point forward, Maria's condition continued to deteriorate, with periods of lucidity becoming rarer and shorter. Maria's mental illness has been the subject of considerable speculation. Some historians suggest it was triggered by a series of traumatic events, the deaths of her husband, her eldest son, and her daughter Maria within a short period, combined with guilt over her role in the expulsion of the Jesuits from Portugal and the execution of some of her father's political enemies. Others point to a possible hereditary component, noting that mental illness appeared in other members of her family. Her grandmother, also named Maria, had shown signs of mental instability. Several of her siblings had health problems. And the practice of uncle-niece marriage, combined with generations of cousin marriages in her ancestry, may have concentrated genes associated with mental illness, making her more vulnerable to psychological breakdown. The religious dimension of Maria's delusions is particularly striking. She was convinced that she was damned because of her sins, particularly her supposed role in various injustices during her reign. She believed that her husband Pedro was in hell because he had supported the expulsion of the Jesuits and that his suffering was partially her fault. She believed that her confessor was also in hell and that she would join them. These delusions were reinforced by the intensely religious culture of the Portuguese court, where questions of sin, salvation, and damnation were taken with complete seriousness. Maria's spiritual advisors, rather than helping her, may have actually made things worse by engaging with her delusions as if they were real spiritual crises rather than symptoms of mental illness. What's particularly tragic about Maria's story is how long she lived with her illness. She was declared incapacitated in 1792 and died in 1816, 24 years later, spending more than 2 decades locked away, tormented by delusions and hallucinations, occasionally lucid but mostly lost in her own mental anguish. When Napoleon's forces invaded Portugal in 1807, the royal family fled to Brazil, taking Maria with them. She spent the last years of her life in Rio de Janeiro, far from her homeland, still suffering from her illness, largely forgotten by the world. She died at age 81, having spent a third of her life as a prisoner of her own deteriorating mind. The journey to Brazil must have been particularly traumatic for Maria in her condition. She was essentially imprisoned on a ship for weeks, surrounded by strangers, unable to understand what was happening or why she was being taken from familiar surroundings. Once in Brazil, she was kept in apartments in Rio de Janeiro, still under guard, still isolated, but now in a tropical climate very different from Portugal, hearing unfamiliar sounds and seeing unfamiliar sights. Whether she had enough lucidity to understand that she was in a completely different part of the world, that she would never return to Portugal, is unclear from the historical record. She died in Rio de Janeiro in March 1816, and her body was eventually returned to Portugal for burial in the Royal Pantheon. Maria's daughter, who had died before her mother's mental breakdown, was another Maria, Maria Francisca Benedita, who married her uncle Gabriel of Spain. Yes, another uncle-niece marriage, continuing the pattern into yet another generation. This younger Maria died at age 27 without surviving children, another example of the high mortality rates in these inbred royal lines. Maria I's son John, who ruled as Prince Regent and later as John VI, married Charlotte of Spain, his first cousin once removed, and they had 9 children, several of whom showed various health problems. The cycle continued, generation after generation, with each new round of close family marriages adding to the genetic burden. John VI and Charlotte of Spain's marriage was notoriously unhappy. Charlotte was intelligent and politically ambitious, constantly interfering in governmental affairs and trying to increase her own power. John was indecisive and preferred to avoid conflict, which led to constant tensions. Charlotte openly despised her husband and made no secret of her affairs with various courtiers. Their children grew up in this dysfunctional environment, with several showing signs of emotional and psychological problems that may have been partially due to their upbringing and partially due to their genetic heritage. One of their sons, Miguel, became a reactionary political figure who tried to establish an absolutist regime in Portugal, leading to civil war. Another son, Pedro, became Emperor of Brazil when that colony declared independence, creating a separate branch of the family. We should also examine the Wittelsbach family of Bavaria, because they provide another striking example of how inbreeding affected both physical and mental health across generations. The Wittelsbachs ruled Bavaria for centuries, and like other European royal families, they practiced extensive intermarriage with their relatives. One of the most famous members of this family was Alexandra of Bavaria, who lived from 1826 to 1875, and whose mental illness was so severe that she was confined for much of her adult life. Alexandra was the daughter of Ludwig I of Bavaria and Therese of Saxe-Hildburghausen, herself the product of close family marriages. The Wittelsbach family had ruled Bavaria since the 12th century, accumulating power and territories through strategic marriages and political maneuvering. By the 19th century, they were one of the most prominent German royal families, with branches ruling not just Bavaria, but also the Palatinate and, eventually, briefly, Greece. But like other long-established royal dynasties, they had a family tree dense with cousin marriages and other close relationships. Ludwig I himself was the product of a cousin marriage, and his wife Therese came from the Saxon royal family, which had its own history of intermarriage with other German dynasties. From a young age, Alexandra showed signs of psychological problems. From a young age, Alexandra showed signs of psychological problems.
She developed an obsessive belief that she had swallowed a glass piano as a child and that it was still inside her body. She became terrified of wearing white or of walking down corridors, believing that the glass piano would shatter if she did these things. She would only wear dark colors and would walk sideways through doorways and hallways, pressing her back against the wall. This delusional belief persisted throughout her life, despite all attempts to convince her otherwise. She also showed other symptoms that suggest a serious psychotic disorder, possibly schizophrenia. She heard voices, had visual hallucinations, experienced paranoid thoughts, and went through periods of catatonia, where she would remain motionless for hours. Alexandra's delusion about the glass piano is one of the strangest recorded examples of a persistent delusional belief in a royal figure. According to her own accounts, she believed that when she was a small child, she had somehow swallowed a glass piano made of Venetian glass. She remembered this as a real event, though, of course, it never actually happened. She believed the piano was still inside her, intact, and that she had to be extremely careful in her movements to avoid breaking it. Breaking the piano, she believed, would kill her instantly. This belief governed her entire life, dictating what she could wear, how she could move, where she could go, what she could do. No amount of rational argument could shake her conviction that the piano was real and inside her. Alexandra was never allowed to marry, which was probably a relief to her family given her condition, though it meant she lived her entire adult life under the control of her relatives. She spent most of her time in various castles and residences, under supervision, with doctors and attendants monitoring her constantly. During her more lucid periods, she was apparently intelligent and interested in literature and music, but these periods became less frequent as she aged. She died at age 48. Having lived most of her life trapped in a reality distorted by mental illness. Her brothers and sisters also showed various problems. Her brother Otto became King of Bavaria, but was himself severely mentally ill, suffering from what was probably schizophrenia, and was eventually deposed and kept under medical supervision for the rest of his life. Otto I of Bavaria's mental illness was different from Alexandra's, but equally severe. He began showing symptoms in his 20s, including paranoid delusions, hallucinations, and violent behavior. He would have episodes where he believed people were trying to poison him or that he was being persecuted by various conspiracies. He would sometimes become violent, attacking servants or throwing furniture. He was sent to various doctors and specialists, but no treatment helped. When his father Ludwig II died, and Otto was technically supposed to become king, it was immediately clear that he couldn't fulfill the role. His uncle Luitpold was made regent and ruled in Otto's name for many years. When Luitpold died, Luitpold's son continued as regent. Otto remained king in title, but never ruled, spending his entire reign confined under medical supervision, until he was finally deposed in 1913. He died 3 years later, never having had a lucid moment in his adult life. The Wittelsbach family's history of mental illness extends across multiple generations. Alexandra's great-great-great-aunt, Maria Anna Sophia of Bavaria, who lived in the 18th century, also suffered from mental illness and was kept in seclusion. Several other family members showed signs of psychological problems, from depression to psychosis.
The family tree is dense with cousin marriages and marriages between uncles and nieces, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries. While we can't definitively prove that inbreeding caused the mental illness in the Wittelsbach line, the pattern is suggestive, especially when we see similar patterns in other inbred royal families like the Habsburgs and the Portuguese royals. Another dimension of this story involves the physical deformities that became increasingly common in inbred royal lines. We've discussed the Habsburg jaw, but there were many other physical problems. Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, who lived from 1714 to 1784 and married Charles III of Spain, was reportedly quite unattractive, with a severe overbite, a long face, and crossed eyes. Her mother was Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, and her father was Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor, who was himself a product of multiple generations of Habsburg marriages. Maria Antonia's appearance reflected her genetic heritage, and while she successfully had many children with Charles III, several of her children showed their own physical and mental problems. One of Maria Antonia's sons, Philip, Duke of Calabria, was born with severe disabilities. He had epilepsy, was intellectually disabled, and died young, at age 23. Another son, Ferdinand, who became Ferdinand IV of Naples and later Ferdinand I of the Two Sicilies, was described as crude, vulgar, and not particularly intelligent, though he managed to rule for many years. He married Maria Carolina of Austria, a daughter of Maria Theresa of Austria, continuing the pattern of marriages between closely related royal families. Maria Carolina herself was the product of a marriage between Maria Theresa and her second cousin Francis I, so she brought her own genetic baggage into the marriage. Maria Carolina and Ferdinand had 18 children, an extraordinary number even for that era, but many died young and several showed signs of physical or developmental problems. The pattern becomes exhausting to catalog because it's so repetitive. Generation after generation, we see the same practices leading to the same results: high rates of infant and child mortality, physical deformities, intellectual disabilities, mental illness, infertility, and shortened lifespans. And through all of this, royal women bore the brunt of the suffering. They were the ones going through pregnancy after pregnancy, often knowing that their babies had a high chance of dying or being born with serious problems. They were the ones who had to live with husbands who might be intellectually disabled, physically deformed, or mentally unstable. They were the ones who could be declared insane and locked away if they became inconvenient. They were the ones whose only value was their ability to produce heirs, and who could be discarded or divorced if they failed in that role. Consider the experience of pregnancy and childbirth for these women. In the medieval and early modern periods, childbirth was dangerous for all women, with high rates of maternal mortality from infections, hemorrhaging, obstructed labor, and other complications. But for women carrying babies with genetic problems, the risks were even higher. Babies with severe genetic abnormalities are more likely to be in abnormal positions in the womb, more likely to cause obstructed labor, more likely to die during delivery, and cause infections. Women in inbred royal families often went through multiple stillbirths and miscarriages, each one a physical trauma and an emotional devastation. They were expected to get pregnant again immediately, to keep trying until they produced a healthy heir, with no time to grieve or recover. The medical care available to these women was primitive by modern standards and often actively harmful.
Bloodletting was a common treatment for various conditions, which would have weakened women who were already dealing with the physical stress of repeated pregnancies. Purging with various substances was another common treatment, causing dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. When deliveries were difficult, doctors and midwives had limited options. Forceps existed, but were dangerous and often caused injury to both mother and baby. Cesarean sections were performed occasionally, but were usually fatal to the mother in an age before anesthesia, antiseptic technique, or antibiotics. If a baby was stuck, doctors might perform a craniotomy, crushing the baby's skull to remove it and save the mother's life, a horrific procedure that royal women sometimes endured. The instruments used in difficult deliveries were terrifying even to look at. Forceps, when they were used, were large metal tongs that had to be inserted into the birth canal and around the baby's head, then used to pull the baby out. In inexperienced hands, they could crush the baby's skull or tear the mother's tissues, causing hemorrhaging or fistulas. The crochet or hook was an instrument used to grab hold of a dead baby's body to extract it, but it could only be used if the baby was already dead or dying. The perforator was an instrument used to pierce a baby's skull to allow a craniotomy to be performed. These instruments were used without anesthesia, meaning women had to endure these procedures while fully conscious and feeling everything. Religious and cultural expectations added another layer of suffering. Royal women were expected to accept their lot with piety and resignation, to see their suffering as God's will, to pray for strength rather than questioning why they had to endure so much. If their babies died, they were told it was part of God's plan. If they themselves suffered health problems from repeated pregnancies, they were expected to bear it with grace. Complaining or showing too much distress could be seen as a lack of proper religious faith or feminine virtue. These women lived in a world that gave them no control over their own bodies, no choice about when or how often to become pregnant, no ability to refuse their husbands or to demand better treatment. The theological framework that justified this suffering was elaborate and deeply embedded in Christian culture. Women's pain in childbirth was explicitly mentioned in the Bible as punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. According to Genesis, God told Eve, "In pain you shall bring forth children," and this was interpreted as meaning that women's suffering in childbirth was divinely ordained, a necessary consequence of original sin. Some theologians even argued that this suffering was redemptive, that women could earn salvation through faithful endurance of the pains of pregnancy and childbirth. This framework made it very difficult for women to protest or seek relief from their suffering, because doing so could be seen as rebelling against God's will. The age at which royal women married also contributed to their suffering. Many were married in their early teens, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, and expected to begin bearing children as soon as they reached physical maturity. Their bodies were often not fully developed, making pregnancy and childbirth even more dangerous. A girl of 14 or 15 who becomes pregnant is at higher risk for complications than a woman in her 20s. But royal families were impatient for heirs and eager to cement political alliances, so young girls were married off and expected to start producing babies immediately. Some died in childbirth while still in their teens, their bodies unable to handle the physical demands of pregnancy and delivery. The practice of arranging marriages for girls at a very young age was often defended using different cultural and traditional arguments. Legally, canon law set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, based on assumptions about when they reached physical maturity. Politically, early marriages secured alliances sooner and prevented other families from making competing arrangements. Culturally, there was an assumption that younger wives would be more malleable, easier to train in the ways of their new families, less likely to have formed strong attachments elsewhere. The fact that early marriage and pregnancy were dangerous was acknowledged but seen as acceptable risk, part of women's natural role and duty. Let's talk about Maria Theresa of Austria now, not to be confused with Maria Theresa of Spain, whom we discussed earlier. This Maria Theresa, who lived from 1717 to 1780, was one of the most powerful rulers of the 18th century, the only woman to rule the Habsburg territories in her own right. She was the daughter of Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor, and Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, another cousin marriage, though not as close as some Habsburg marriages. Maria Theresa married Francis Stephen of Lorraine in 1736, a marriage that brought some genetic diversity into the Habsburg line, since Francis was not closely related to the Habsburgs. This would prove beneficial for the health of their children. Maria Theresa's accession to power was itself remarkable and required overcoming significant obstacles. Her father, Charles VI, had no sons, and he spent much of his reign trying to ensure that his daughter would inherit his territories intact. This required convincing the various European powers to accept female succession, which went against tradition in many territories. Charles issued the Pragmatic Sanction, a legal document declaring that his territories should pass undivided to his daughter, and he spent years getting other powers to agree to recognize it. When Charles died in 1740, Maria Theresa inherited his territories, but several powers immediately challenged her right to rule, leading to the War of Austrian Succession. Maria Theresa and Francis had 16 children over 20 years, an exhausting number of pregnancies by any standard. Maria Theresa was essentially constantly pregnant or recovering from pregnancy throughout her 20s and 30s. She gave birth to her first child at age 17 and her last at age 39. Despite the healthier genetic background from her father's side, several of her children died young. Her second child, Maria Anna, lived to adulthood but was described as having a curved spine and being generally frail. Her son Charles lived only 16 years, dying of smallpox. Her daughter, Maria Johanna, died at age 12, also from smallpox. Her youngest daughter, Maria Carolina, was originally intended for a convent, but was instead married to Ferdinand of Naples when her older sister, who had been engaged to Ferdinand, died of smallpox before the wedding could take place. Maria Theresa's experience of constant pregnancy while ruling a major empire must have been extraordinarily challenging. She was dealing with wars, managing complex diplomatic negotiations, overseeing the administration of vast territories, implementing reforms, all while pregnant or recovering from childbirth for much of her adult life. She sometimes held council meetings in her bedroom in the days after giving birth, conducting state business while still in bed recovering. She corresponded with military commanders, made decisions about taxation and policy, appointed officials, all while managing the physical demands of pregnancy and caring for her many children. Her ability to function effectively as a ruler despite these burdens demonstrates remarkable resilience and capability. What's significant about Maria Theresa is that despite the physical toll of bearing 16 children and the emotional toll of losing several of them, She was an effective ruler. She successfully defended her territories against various challenges, modernized the Austrian state, supported education and cultural development, and maintained Austria's position as a major European power. But she was also the mother who arranged her children's marriages, and she followed the traditional policy of using marriages to forge political alliances. This meant marrying her daughters off to various European rulers, often in situations where the girls would be unhappy or trapped in difficult circumstances. The most famous of Maria Theresa's daughters, of course, is Marie Antoinette, who married Louis XVI of France and was eventually executed during the French Revolution. At just 14, Marie Antoinette was sent to France, leaving behind her home and family. She entered the challenging and often hostile world of the French court, where she was married to a young prince who, for many years, did not fully assume the responsibilities expected of him as a husband. Her mother, Maria Theresa, maintained correspondence with her, often scolding her for not doing enough to secure Louis's affections or to produce heirs, not understanding or not caring about the difficulties Marie Antoinette faced. When Marie Antoinette was eventually executed in 1793, after the fall of the French monarchy, Maria Theresa had been dead for 13 years, spared the knowledge of her daughter's terrible fate. But relevant to our discussion of inbreeding is Maria Theresa's daughter, Maria Carolina, whom we mentioned earlier, who married Ferdinand IV of Naples. This marriage brought together two relatively inbred lines, Maria Carolina's Habsburg-Lorraine heritage and Ferdinand's Spanish Bourbon and Austrian Habsburg heritage. Their children showed mixed results. Some were healthy and capable, others had problems. One of their daughters, Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily, married Francis II of Austria, who was actually her first cousin, being the son of Maria Carolina's sister, Maria Louisa. So we see the pattern continuing into the next generation, with the various Habsburg and Bourbon lines intermarrying repeatedly. Maria Carolina herself was an extraordinary woman, intelligent, politically ambitious, and actively involved in governing Naples alongside her husband Ferdinand. She effectively ruled Naples for many years, with Ferdinand content to pursue his own pleasures while she handled the actual business of government. She was a patron of the arts and culture, bringing Enlightenment ideas to Naples, supporting education and reform. She was also deeply involved in the diplomatic and military struggles of her time, forming alliances against revolutionary and Napoleonic France, corresponding with her relatives across Europe, trying to maintain Austrian and Bourbon power in Italy. Her life demonstrates that even women from inbred families could be highly capable when given the opportunity to exercise power. Another of Maria Theresa of Austria's daughters was Maria Amalia, who married Ferdinand of Parma. This marriage was less inbred than some, bringing in the Bourbon-Parma line, but Maria Amalia's life was marked by repeated pregnancies and the loss of several children. She had 7 children, 3 of whom died in childhood or adolescence. She herself died at age 32, possibly from complications following the birth of her last child, though the exact cause isn't certain. Her early death left her surviving children to be raised primarily by others, and her husband remarried, needing more heirs for his duchy. Maria Amalia's story is typical of countless royal women who died young, worn out by repeated childbearing, their lives consumed by the demand for heirs. We should also consider the experience of women who married into inbred families from outside, bringing healthier genetic material but finding themselves trapped in dysfunctional family systems.
Marie-Louise of Orleans, the first wife of Charles II of Spain, is a perfect example. Marie-Louise was the daughter of Philip of France, Duke of Orleans, and his first wife, Henrietta of England. Her genetic heritage was much healthier than Charles's, with no recent inbreeding in her immediate family. She was reportedly attractive, intelligent, and charming when she arrived in Spain in 1679 at age 17 to marry Charles, who was 18. The marriage was a disaster from the beginning. Charles was physically repulsive and intellectually limited, unable to function as a husband in any normal sense. Marie-Louise found herself in a strange court, surrounded by rigid Spanish etiquette, expected to produce heirs with a man who couldn't father children, and blamed for the failure. Contemporary accounts suggest that Marie-Louise was deeply unhappy in Spain, that she wrote letters home describing her misery, that she begged her family to help her escape. But there was no escape from a royal marriage. Divorce was not an option for Catholic royalty. She was stuck in Spain, stuck with Charles, stuck in a situation that would never improve. Spanish court etiquette in this period was notoriously rigid and stifling, especially for someone like Marie-Louise, who came from the more relaxed French court. Everything was governed by complex rules about precedence, dress, behavior, speech. The queen was constantly surrounded by ladies-in-waiting and attendants, never having a moment of privacy. She had to dress in Spanish fashion, which Marie-Louise found uncomfortable and unattractive compared to French styles. She had to learn Spanish customs and manners, had to attend endless religious ceremonies, had to maintain perfect dignity and composure at all times. And through all of this, she had to endure marriage to Charles, had to accept the blame for not producing children, had to watch as her youth and beauty faded in unhappiness. Marie-Louise died suddenly in 1689 at age 26 after 10 years of marriage and no children. The official cause was given as stomach pains and fever, possibly appendicitis or some other acute abdominal condition. But there were rumors at the time of poisoning, suspicions that someone at court had decided to eliminate her so that Charles could remarry and try again for an heir with a different wife. Whether these rumors had any basis in truth is unknown. What's clear is that Marie-Louise spent her 20s, what should have been the prime years of her life, trapped in a miserable situation not of her making, serving as a scapegoat for Charles's inability to produce children, and dying young, possibly from natural causes, but possibly not, in a foreign country far from her family and everything familiar. The rumors of poisoning centered on various court factions who had different ideas about the succession and who might benefit from Charles remarrying. Some suspected the Austrian Habsburg faction, who wanted Charles to marry an Austrian princess who would be more sympathetic to Austrian interests. Others suspected various Spanish noble families who had their own political agendas. The fact that Marie-Louise died so suddenly, going from apparently healthy to dead within a few days, fueled suspicions. But autopsy practices were limited. Understanding of internal medicine was poor, and the truth was never established. Marie-Louise was buried with royal honors, and Charles was quickly remarried to Maria Anna of Neuburg, who would face her own decade of disappointment and blame. The psychological impact of these situations on royal women is something we can only imagine. Historical records tend to focus on political events, military campaigns,
diplomatic negotiations, the public actions of rulers. Personal feelings, private struggles, emotional suffering, these things were rarely recorded in detail, especially for women. But we can infer from the fragmentary evidence we have that many of these women lived lives of quiet desperation. They were valuable only as long as they could produce heirs, and preferably male heirs. If they failed, they could be divorced, sent away, or simply ignored while their husbands took mistresses and fathered illegitimate children who might be acknowledged and given positions at court. Even when royal women successfully produced heirs, they often had little control over their children's upbringing. Children were taken away to be raised by nurses, governesses, and tutors. Mothers might see their children only briefly each day, in formal visits where proper etiquette had to be maintained. The emotional bond between mother and child was seen as less important than proper royal training, learning languages, mastering protocol, understanding politics, and strategy. When these children were married off to forge alliances, mothers rarely had any say in the matter. They might advocate for or against certain matches, but the final decisions were made by kings and male advisors. And they had to watch their daughters be sent away to foreign courts, knowing they might never see them again, knowing those daughters would face the same pressures and dangers they themselves had faced. The separation of royal mothers from their children started early and was absolute. In many courts, a royal baby would be taken from its mother within hours or days of birth and given to wet nooses and other caregivers. The mother might be allowed to visit, but she wouldn't be the primary caregiver. The mother might be allowed to visit, but she wouldn't be the primary caregiver. As the children grew, they would be moved to their own apartments within the palace, with their own households of servants and tutors. The mother would see them at designated times, in formal settings, where she was expected to be queenly and dignified rather than maternal and affectionate. This system prevented the formation of close emotional bonds between mothers and children, which was seen as desirable because it ensured that children would be raised according to royal standards rather than being spoiled by maternal affection. The religious dimension of these women's lives also deserves attention. Most were raised as devout Catholics, taught that suffering was redemptive, that God gave burdens only to those strong enough to bear them, that earthly suffering would be rewarded in heaven. When their babies died, when they suffered miscarriages, when they endured difficult pregnancies and painful deliveries, they were expected to see these trials as opportunities to grow in faith. Prayer was the recommended remedy for almost everything, along with relics, pilgrimages, masses said for their intentions. Some royal women found genuine comfort in religion, developing deep spiritual lives that helped them cope with their circumstances. Others went through the motions of piety because it was expected, while privately despairing. Religious mania, like what afflicted Maria I of Portugal, might have been partly a result of this intense religious pressure, combined with genetic predisposition to mental illness. When you're taught that your suffering is somehow your fault, that you must have sinned to deserve such trials, that you need to pray harder and be more devout, and when this message is reinforced constantly by confessors and spiritual advisors, it can create enormous psychological pressure. For someone already vulnerable to mental illness due to genetic factors, this pressure could trigger a complete psychological breakdown. Maria I's delusions about being damned, about going to hell, about being tormented by demons, all fit the pattern of religious scrupulosity taken to a psychotic extreme,
possibly enabled by whatever genetic factors predisposed her to mental illness in the first place. Another aspect of royal women's experience in inbred families was the physical changes that pregnancy could cause, especially repeated pregnancies. Multiple pregnancies can affect a woman's teeth, causing decay and loss because the developing babies draw calcium from the mother's body. They can affect bone density for the same reason. They can cause hernias, prolapse of pelvic organs, varicose veins, chronic back problems, damage to the pelvic floor muscles. Many royal women in their 30s and 40s were probably dealing with chronic pain and physical disabilities caused by having too many children too close together. But these were not problems that would be discussed openly or documented in official records. Women were expected to maintain dignity and not complain about physical problems, especially problems related to their reproductive functions. The dental problems that afflicted many royal women from repeated pregnancies would have been particularly troublesome in an era before modern dentistry. Tooth decay would cause constant pain. Infections in the teeth and gums would be common, and eventually, teeth would be lost. Without proper dental care, which didn't exist in any modern sense until well into the 19th century, these problems would only get worse over time. Some royal women were described as having terrible breath or being reluctant to smile, which may have reflected dental problems they were dealing with. The loss of teeth would also affect nutrition, making it harder to chew food properly, potentially leading to digestive problems and malnutrition, despite having access to plenty of food. The practice of royal wet nursing also affected these women's experiences. In most European royal courts, mothers did not nurse their own babies. Instead, wet nurses were hired to breastfeed the infants, while the mothers were expected to become pregnant again as soon as possible. Breastfeeding naturally suppresses fertility to some degree. So, by not nursing, royal women would become pregnant again more quickly, maximizing the number of children they could produce. This practice meant that mothers had less physical bonding time with their infants, and it meant their bodies got less recovery time between pregnancies. It also meant that more babies died, because breast milk provides important antibodies that protect infants from disease, and wet nurse's milk might not provide the same protection, especially if the wet nurse was nursing multiple babies or was herself not in good health. The selection of wet nurses was taken very seriously in royal courts because everyone understood that the health and even the personality of the baby might be affected by the nurse's milk. Elaborate criteria were developed for choosing wet nurses. They should be of good moral character, since it was believed that moral traits could be transmitted through milk. They should be healthy, with good skin and teeth, robust constitution. They should have recently given birth themselves, so their milk would be plentiful. They should eat a proper diet, avoiding foods thought to be harmful or to impart bad qualities. They should not be given to excessive emotions or bad habits. Despite all these precautions, wet nursing remained risky for the babies, who were being raised by servants rather than their mothers and fed by women who might be nursing multiple infants and couldn't provide the same quality of care a mother might. Let's return to the genetic science underlying all of this suffering, because understanding the mechanism helps us understand why the effects accumulated over generations. Each person has 2 copies of most genes, one from each parent. Genes exist in different versions called alleles. Some alleles are dominant, meaning that if you inherit even one copy, it will affect your traits. Others are recessive, meaning you need to inherit 2 copies, one from each parent, for the trait to appear. Many genetic diseases and disorders are caused by recessive alleles. In a large, diverse population, most recessive disease alleles are rare. Two unrelated people are unlikely to both carry the same rare recessive allele, so their children are unlikely to inherit two copies and develop the disease. But when close relatives marry, they share many of the same alleles because they inherited them from common ancestors. If a particular recessive disease allele is present in a family, cousins might both carry it. If they marry and have children, there's a significant chance their children will inherit two copies and develop the disease. The closer the relationship between the parents, the more alleles they share, and the higher the probability of genetic problems. With uncle-niece or first-cousin marriages, the risk is elevated but not catastrophic in a single generation. Problems really accumulate when this pattern continues for multiple generations, when the family's gene pool becomes smaller and smaller, when more and more harmful recessive alleles become common in the family. Modern genetic studies have identified many of the specific genes and mutations that were likely causing problems in these inbred royal families. For example, the gene responsible for some forms of hemophilia, a bleeding disorder that affected several royal families, including the descendants of Queen Victoria, has been identified and studied. The genes involved in various metabolic disorders, immune system problems, and developmental abnormalities that would have contributed to the high infant mortality rates have also been identified. Understanding these specific genetic mechanisms helps us appreciate just how damaging the practice of inbreeding was and how much unnecessary suffering it caused. This is what happened with the Habsburgs. In the early generations, when the family was first rising to power in the 13th and 14th centuries, Habsburg marriages included plenty of spouses from unrelated families. The family was healthy and vigorous. But as they became more powerful and more concerned with maintaining their status, they began marrying more exclusively within related noble and royal families. By the 16th century, they were regularly marrying first cousins. By the 17th century, they were marrying uncles to nieces, and the family trees were becoming tangled webs where the same ancestors appeared in multiple positions. Charles II was the culmination of this process, a human being so genetically compromised that he could barely function and certainly couldn't reproduce. The Habsburg jaw, that distinctive underbite, is thought to be caused by a combination of genetic factors affecting the development of the lower jaw and midface. It's not a single gene trait, but rather a complex trait influenced by multiple genes. The more generations of inbreeding, the more likely these particular combinations of alleles would appear together, making the trait more and more pronounced. By Charles II's generation, the underbite was so severe that he couldn't chew food, couldn't speak clearly, was constantly drooling. This wasn't just a cosmetic issue, but a serious disability that affected his quality of life every single day. And it was entirely preventable. If the Habsburgs had married outside their family for even a few generations, bringing in genetic diversity, the trait would have been diluted and probably disappeared. Recent studies using computer analysis of Habsburg portraits have attempted to quantify the severity of the Habsburg jaw across generations. Researchers measured facial features in portraits and correlated them with genealogical data about the degree of inbreeding in each individual.
The results showed a clear correlation between the coefficient of inbreeding and the severity of maxillary deficiency and mandibular prognathism, the technical terms for the underdeveloped upper jaw and overdeveloped lower jaw that created the characteristic Habsburg appearance. The more inbred an individual was, the more severe these facial features became. Charles II, with the highest coefficient of inbreeding, showed the most extreme facial deformities. The intellectual disabilities seen in many inbred royal lines are harder to trace to specific genetic causes, but they follow predictable patterns. Intelligence is influenced by many genes, and there are also many genes that, when damaged or present in harmful combinations, can cause intellectual disability, seizures, developmental delays, and other neurological problems. Inbreeding increases the chances that harmful combinations will occur. It also increases the chances of de novo mutations having negative effects, because if a new harmful mutation appears in an inbred family, it's more likely to find itself paired with another problematic allele that's already common in the family. The result is children like Charles II, who learned to speak very late, never learned to read well, couldn't handle complex ideas, and was described by contemporaries as having the mind of a child even as an adult. Mental illness is even more complex because it involves both genetic and environmental factors. Conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and severe depression have genetic components, meaning they run in families, but they're not purely genetic. Stress, trauma, infections, nutritional deficiencies, and many other factors can trigger or worsen these conditions in people who are genetically vulnerable. Royal women in inbred families might have been carrying genetic risk factors for mental illness, inherited from generations of close family marriages, and then the stress of their lives, the repeated pregnancies and losses, the political pressures, the isolation, the lack of control over their own circumstances could trigger the actual illness. This is likely what happened with Joanna of Castile, Maria I of Portugal, Alexandra of Bavaria, and many others. The environment in which these women lived would have been conducive to developing mental health problems even without genetic predisposition. They were isolated from their families of origin, living in foreign courts where they might not even speak the language fluently. They were under constant observation and judgment, with every action scrutinized for its political implications. They had no privacy, no ability to make meaningful choices about their own lives. They were valued only for their reproductive capacity and judged harshly when they failed to produce healthy heirs. They watched their children die with heartbreaking frequency. They were married to men they often didn't love, sometimes to men who were physically repulsive or mentally impaired. All of this would be enough to cause psychological problems in anyone, but for someone with genetic vulnerability to mental illness, it could be the trigger that led to complete breakdown. The question of whether these royal women were treated fairly by historians is worth considering. Many of them were labeled as mad, hysterical, emotionally unstable, when in fact they might have been entirely rational responses to impossible situations. Joanna of Castile, for example, was declared insane largely on the testimony of men who had political reasons to want her declared incompetent. Her grief over her husband's death, her anger at being sidelined and imprisoned, her despair at being separated from her children, these are normal human emotions. But a woman showing strong emotions in that era could easily be labeled as hysterical or insane, especially if it was politically convenient to do so.
Similarly, women who suffered from actual mental illness, like Maria I of Portugal or Alexandra of Bavaria, were treated with a mixture of ignorance and cruelty. They were locked away, restrained, subjected to treatments that were useless at best and harmful at worst, isolated from human comfort. Modern historical scholarship has begun to reevaluate many of these women, looking at their lives with more sympathy and trying to distinguish between genuine mental illness, rational responses to terrible situations, and politically motivated declarations of insanity. Feminist historians, in particular, have pointed out how the label of madness was weaponized against women who challenged male authority or who simply had the misfortune to become inconvenient to powerful men. The treatment of Joanna of Castile is now often seen as a case of political imprisonment justified by exaggerated claims about mental illness rather than a genuine case of insanity requiring confinement. Even in cases of actual mental illness, modern scholars recognize that these women deserved compassion and proper medical care rather than imprisonment and neglect. The tragedy of these stories is that so much suffering was preventable. If European royal families had understood genetics, if they had recognized that marrying close relatives was dangerous, they could have avoided most of these problems. But they were trapped by their own ideology, their belief in the special nature of royal blood, their conviction that maintaining pure bloodlines was more important than the health and happiness of individuals. They sacrificed generation after generation of women and children to this ideology, watched families decline and die out, saw undeniable evidence of the problems caused by inbreeding, and still continued the practice because changing would have meant admitting that their assumptions about royal blood and divine right were wrong. There were occasional voices raised against the practice of close family marriages, even in earlier centuries before genetic science existed. Some physicians and natural philosophers observed that marriages between close relatives seemed to produce weaker offspring and advised against it. Some church officials, uncomfortable with granting dispensations for very close relationships, tried to argue that the prohibitions should be enforced more strictly. But these voices were marginalized or ignored because the political and ideological reasons for inbreeding were too powerful. Royal families were willing to sacrifice the health of their descendants to maintain their monopoly on power and their belief in the superiority of their bloodlines. It's also worth noting that not all royal families practiced inbreeding to the same extreme degree. The English royal family, for example, had less inbreeding than the Habsburgs or Portuguese royals, partly because English succession laws and political circumstances meant that marriages to foreign royalty from diverse backgrounds were often advantageous. The French royal family also had somewhat more genetic diversity, though they certainly had their share of cousin marriages. These families tended to be healthier and more vigorous than the most inbred lines, though they still had problems. But the correlation between the degree of inbreeding and the severity of genetic problems is clear when you compare different royal families across Europe. The English royal family's relative genetic health compared to the Habsburgs was partly accidental, the result of historical circumstances rather than any conscious policy. England was somewhat geographically isolated, and English monarchs often needed to form alliances with continental powers through marriage, which meant bringing in spouses from different royal families. The Wars of the Roses in the 15th century disrupted the normal succession, eventually bringing the Tudor dynasty to power, which brought in Welsh and some degree of common English blood.
The Tudor line died out with Elizabeth I, and the throne passed to the Stuart kings of Scotland, another shift that brought in genetic diversity. When the Stuarts were replaced by the Hanoverian dynasty in the 18th century, this brought in German blood that was less closely related to previous English royalty.
All of these dynastic changes, while politically tumultuous, had the unintended benefit of maintaining genetic diversity. One could argue that the practice of royal inbreeding was a form of slow-motion family self-destruction.
By prioritizing political considerations and ideology over biological reality, these families gradually undermined their own health and viability. The Habsburg line in Spain died out completely with Charles II. Other branches of the family survived longer, but showed declining health and vigor. The Portuguese royal families struggled with mental illness and early mortality. The Bavarian Wittelsbachs had severe mental health problems. None of these were sustainable situations. Eventually, most European royal families either died out in the male line, as happened with the Habsburgs in Spain, or were forced to accept more distant relatives or outside families taking over the throne, bringing in the genetic diversity that should have been present all along. The end of the practice of extreme inbreeding in European royal families came gradually through the 19th and 20th centuries. As genetic science developed and the mechanisms of heredity became understood, it became impossible to ignore the connection between inbreeding and health problems. The example of the Habsburgs, particularly Charles II, became a cautionary tale taught in biology classes. Royal families began to marry more widely, accepting spouses from non-royal or distantly related families. The social and political changes that diminished the power of monarchy also reduced the pressure to maintain pure bloodlines. As royal families became more ceremonial and less politically powerful, the obsession with dynastic purity faded. Modern European royalty still exists in several countries, but they marry with much more genetic diversity, and the health problems that plagued earlier generations have largely disappeared. The women in these stories deserve to be remembered not just as queens and princesses, but as human beings who suffered, who endured impossible situations with whatever courage and resilience they could muster, who did their best to fulfill roles that were often literally impossible. They deserve recognition for surviving pregnancies that modern women might not survive even with medical technology. They deserve recognition for maintaining dignity and grace while dealing with husbands who were disabled, deformed, or incompetent. They deserve recognition for coping with the loss of child after child, the loneliness of being married off to foreign courts, the powerlessness of having no control over their own lives. And they deserve recognition for the ways their stories illuminate the cruelty and stupidity of the system that trapped them. These women had names, personalities, hopes, dreams, and fears, but they were treated as interchangeable vessels for continuing bloodlines. Maria Anna of Spain, Joanna of Castile, Cleopatra VII, Mariana of Austria, Maria Theresa of Spain, Isabella of Portugal, Maria Anna of Neuburg, Maria I of Portugal, Alexandra of Bavaria, Maria Carolina of Naples, Maria Amalia of Parma, Marie Louise of Orleans, and countless others whose stories are less well documented. Each of them was an individual who suffered in her own way, who tried to make the best of situations not of her choosing, who paid the price for dynastic ambitions and genetic ignorance.
Their lives were consumed by the demands of a system that saw them as tools rather than people, and their suffering was the direct result of the practice of inbreeding that prioritized ideology over human welfare. As we come to the end of this long journey through royal bloodlines and their consequences, it's important to reflect on what these stories tell us about power, tradition, and the treatment of women throughout history. The practice of royal inbreeding was ultimately a product of patriarchal systems that viewed women as property, as tools for forging alliances and producing heirs, rather than as full human beings with their own needs, desires, and rights. These women had no choice in whom they married, no control over their reproductive lives, no ability to refuse or leave marriages that were making them miserable. They were valued only for their wombs and their family connections, and when they failed to produce healthy heirs through no fault of their own, they were blamed, discarded, or declared insane and locked away. The genetic catastrophes that resulted from generations of inbreeding were entirely preventable and entirely predictable, at least in retrospect. Even without modern genetic science, people in medieval and early modern Europe could see that inbreeding caused problems. Farmers knew not to breed animals too closely because it led to weakness and deformity. Some observers made similar comments about human families. But this knowledge was ignored when it came to royalty because the ideology of pure bloodlines, of divine right, of maintaining exclusive control over wealth and power was more important than the health and happiness of actual people. The result was centuries of unnecessary suffering, families that destroyed themselves through their own misguided policies, and individual women whose lives were consumed by the demands of a system that cared nothing for them as people. These stories also remind us of how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. We no longer practice royal inbreeding in Europe, at least not to the extreme degrees we've discussed. Modern royal families marry people from diverse backgrounds, and while they still face unique pressures and constraints, they're not typically being married to their uncles or forced into marriages with severely disabled cousins. Medical science has advanced enormously, making pregnancy and childbirth much safer, allowing women to control their fertility, providing treatments for genetic diseases and mental illness that would have been unimaginable to our ancestors. But in other ways, the fundamental dynamics haven't changed as much as we might like to think. Women are still often valued primarily for their reproductive capacity, still face enormous pressure around pregnancy and childbearing, still deal with medical systems and social expectations that don't always serve their interests. The legacy of royal inbreeding extends beyond the direct suffering of the individuals involved. These practices shaped European history in profound ways. The inability of the Spanish Habsburgs to produce viable heirs led to the War of Spanish Succession, which reshaped the European balance of power. The mental illness of various monarchs affected their ability to govern effectively, contributing to political instability and poor decision-making that affected millions of people. The weakness and decline of inbred royal lines created power vacuums that led to wars and conflicts. The eventual recognition that inbreeding was harmful contributed to changing attitudes about heredity, science, and the nature of monarchy itself. The history of royal inbreeding is not just a collection of tragic personal stories, but a factor that influenced the broader course of European and world history.
The history of royal inbreeding is ultimately a cautionary tale about what happens when ideology takes precedence over reality, when the needs of systems are prioritized over the needs of individuals, when women are treated as means to ends rather than as ends in themselves. The women we've discussed tonight paid the price for their families' obsession with maintaining pure bloodlines and exclusive control over power. They endured lives of physical suffering, emotional anguish, and often mental illness, trapped in a system that gave them no escape and no voice. Their stories deserve to be told and remembered, not just as historical curiosities, but as reminders of the human cost of treating people as pawns in political games, and as testimonies to the resilience of the human spirit even in the face of extraordinary suffering. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.